An attack seriously injured Amina El-Khassouni, a 7-year-old Bedouin girl in Israel. But look at this video that shows how Israel intercepts Iranian drones above the Temple Mount and Al-Aqsa Mosque. Here, you can look at it. This is the Al-Aqsa Mosque. To Iran, Israel's annihilation and igniting the region is more important than Islamic holy sites. The Ayatollah regime, in its plot to impose a global Shiite hegemony through its proxies, has even attacked Saudi Arabia, as we all remember, Aramco oil field, the United Arab Emirates, and anyone else they view as an obstacle. I asked the Algerian representative here, how does this make you feel? Is this a price you support, attempting to blow up mosques and murdering Muslims? Yet, while this direct Iranian attack on Israel was the first of its kind, it is just the most recent chapter in a blood-soaked saga that started from the moment the Islamic Revolution reared its head. The Ayatollah regime has a clear plan. Its goal has been and continues to be world domination by exporting its radical Shiite revolution across the globe. I assume you all know it. The Islamic regime of today is no different than the Third Reich, and Ayatollah Khamenei is no different than Adolf Hitler. Hitler's Third Reich was envisioned to be a 1,000-year empire stretching across continents, just as Khamenei envisions his radical Shiite hegemony to stretch across the region and beyond. This is why Iran arms themselves with intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs. Iran and Israel are on the same continent. You are next. The Ayatollah regimes acts like the Nazi regime, and their army includes Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Hezbollah, the Houthis, the Revolutionary Guard, and other savage jihadists. Instead of shouting, Sieg Heil, these radical Nazi Islamists scream death to Israel, death to America, death to England. Just like the Nazi regime, the Ayatollah regime sows death and destruction everywhere it touches. For the past years, Ukrainian civilians have been killed from the skies with Iranian weaponry. President Zelensky, in condemnation of Iran's attack last night, said, and I quote, "The sound of Iranian Shahed drones, a tool of terror, is the same in the skies over the Middle East and Europe. This sound must serve as a wake-up call to the free world. Listen to President Zelensky and wake up." Just like the ever-reaching hand of the Wehrmacht, Iran struck Albania with cyber attacks and launches strikes against Kurds in Iraq. We all remember the 2021 attack on the oil tanker Mercer Street, in which British and Romanian crew members were killed. And just yesterday, Iran seized a Portuguese cargo ship. The crew being held right now by Iran includes Indian, Filipino, Pakistani, and Russian nationals. Iran threatens global maritime trade. Iran is not only a terror state, Iran is a pirate state. Colleagues, just this week, the court in Argentina held Iran directly responsible for the 1994 terror attack in Buenos Aires on the Jewish Community Center, which killed 85 people and wounded 300. And just like the Third Reich and their brutal SS officers, the Iranian regime not only spreads evil abroad, but also torments and murders their own citizens. In 2023 alone, the Ayatollah regime executed 834 Iranians. The regime oppresses women while murdering them for not wearing their hijab properly. When the Iranian people peacefully protest this brutality, they are suppressed by live ammunition. Hundreds of protesters were killed and thousands have been arrested. This is a regime that allows its own people to die of thirst in Isfahan, while it funds terror around the world with billions of dollars. What have you done to defend the world from Iran? Seriously, the entire globe is suffering from Iran, including the Iranian people. Please defend them. For years, the world has watched the rise of a Shiite Islamist Reich. Yet, just like during the rise of Nazism, the world has been silent, deafeningly silent. Mr. Secretary General, Iran has been violating Security Council resolutions and the UN Charter for years. They supply Hezbollah with weapons in violation of resolutions 1559 and 1701. They advance weapons proliferation in violation of resolution 2231. They violate resolutions 1540 and 2216. Why have you not used all possible means to condemn Iran and demand compliance? Why have you instead rolled out the red carpet for these genocidal jihadists? Why do you treat them as if they are interested in de-escalation when you know that the opposite is true? Colleagues, Iran's strategy has been crystal clear: arm, fund, and train terror proxies across the globe to carry out Iran's murderous scheme of domination. But today, the mask of Iranian deniability has been removed. No more hiding and no more bluffing. No more shirking of responsibility. Iran has attacked Israel from its own sovereign territory, publicly and proudly. The mask is off. Iran, the #1 global sponsor of terror, has exposed its true face as the destabilizer of the region and the world. And now, right now, is when the world must stop ignoring Iran's crimes and take action. As Iran's mask has fallen, the world's complacency must also fall. The mask comes off, and the gloves must come on. The snooze button is no longer an option. The only option is to condemn Iran and utilize every means necessary to make them pay a heavy price for their horrible crimes. Iran and its axis of supporters must be shown that the civilized world will no longer stand idle. While many countries immediately condemned the attack, those who did not must ask themselves, how do you want history to remember you? Council members, last night's attack was a blatant violation of international law and the UN Charter. It was an act of utter escalation that can drag the entire region and world into war. But can you imagine if the attack was carried out under an Iranian nuclear umbrella? Or if some of Iran's missiles had nuclear warheads? The regime that launched an unprecedented strike on Israel, a fellow member state of the UN, is barreling towards nuclear capabilities. This is a terror state responsible for global destruction, and soon they will have nuclear capabilities. You all know that Iran is systematically violating the JCPOA and has enriched uranium up to 60% purity and even more. Iran's breakout time to produce an arsenal of nuclear weapons is now weeks, mere weeks. No concrete action has been taken, and the IAEA inspectors have been kept in the dark. Iran is on the verge of becoming a nuclear power. It should terrify every member of this council. Take a moment to think what would happen if Ayatollah Khamenei could have launched a nuclear bomb last night. Is this the world we want to live in? So, to the JCPOA signatories, I say, initiate the snapback mechanism today. Initiate it. Impose all possible sanctions on Iran before it's too late. We need a world led by Churchills, not Chamberlains. Colleagues, on October 7th, Hamas, with Iranian funding, with Iranian weaponry, with training, carried out the most brutal massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. They slaughtered our children. They burned entire communities. They raped our women. They took families hostage and are abusing 133 hostages. Hezbollah, with its Iranian arms and sponsorship, have fired thousands of rockets into Israel since October 7th, decimating towns. The Houthis, with Iranian weapons and instructions and intelligence, are firing at every merchant vessel that is suspected of having ties to Israel. And then Iran, who directs and pays for all of this violence, carried out an attack of epic proportions on Israel. Colleagues, we are being fired upon from all fronts, from every border. We are surrounded by Iran's terror proxies. The war in Gaza extends far broader than Israel and Hamas. All of the terror groups attacking Israel are tentacles of the same Shiite octopus, the Iranian octopus. So I ask you, and be honest with yourselves, what would you do? What would you do if you were in Israel's shoes? How would you react if your existence was threatened every single day? While the Ayatollah regime thinks, they only think, that Israel is a frog in a boiling water, that we are becoming accustomed to the threats on our survival and won't notice until it's too late, they are wrong. You are wrong. This attack crossed every red line, and Israel reserves the legal right to retaliate. We are not a frog in boiling water. We are a nation of lions. Following such a massive and direct attack on Israel, the entire world, let alone Israel, cannot settle for inaction. We will defend our future. Colleagues, despite the magnitude of the attack, 99% of Iran's UAVs and missiles were intercepted by Israel and our allies. I wish to take this opportunity to thank the United States and our partners for standing with us in defending Israel against the Ayatollah regime indiscriminate attacks. Yet, the fact that Israel's air defense proved to be superior does not change the brutality of the Iranian attack. Iran can no longer hide behind its proxies. It has now exposed itself as the terror exporting pariah state that it is, and it must, from now on, be treated as such. It's not enough to remove Iran from the UN Commission on the Status of Women. Iran is the world's worst human rights violator, and such a regime cannot hold any UN position. No more red carpet treatment here at the UN. No more appeasement. Today, the Council must take action. Condemn Iran for their terror, trigger the snapback mechanism and reimpose crippling sanctions, designate the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps as a terror organization. Action must be taken now, not for Israel's sake, not for the region's sake, but for the world's sake. Stop Iran today. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Israel. I pass the floor to the representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Thank you. In the name of God, the compassionate and merciful, Madam President, as we informed in our letter last night in response to the Israeli regime's recurring military aggression, particularly its armed attack on 1st April 2024 against Iranian diplomatic premises, a defiance of Article 2 of the Charter of the United Nations, the armed forces of the Islamic Republic of Iran carried out a series of military strikes on Israeli military objectives with dozens of missiles and drones. Iran's operation was entirely in the exercise of Iran's inherent right to self-defense as outlined in Article 51 of the Charter of the United Nations and recognized by international law. This concluded action was necessary and proportionate. It was precise and only targeted military objectives and carried out carefully to minimize the potential for escalation and prevent civilian harm. Madam President, we thank those members of the Council who condemned the Israeli armed attack against our diplomatic premises in Syria. Regrettably, in this chamber, certain members of the Council, including the US, UK, and France, has chosen once again to turn a blind eye to reality and overlook the root causes contributing to the current situation. In hypocritical behavior, these three countries falsely blamed and accused Iran without considering their own failures to uphold their international commitment to peace and security in the region. They made unsuccessful attempts to use lies, manipulate the narrative, spread disinformation, and engage in a destructive blame game, all the while they deliberately disregarded Iran's inherent right to respond to the violation of a fundamental principle of international law, the inviolability of diplomatic representative and premises. Moreover, they ignored the underlying root causes of the current situation in the region. For over 6 months now, these countries, especially the United States, have shielded Israel from any responsibility for the Gaza massacre, while they have denied Iran's inherent right to self-defense against the Israeli armed attack on our diplomatic premises. At the same time, they shamefully justified the Israeli massacre and genocide against the defenseless Palestinian people under the pretext of self-defense. They made cynical attempt to justify and cover up the atrocities of the Israeli regime against the people of Palestine by arbitrary and misleading interpretation of self-defense. Madam President, following the Israeli regime cowardly terrorist and armed attack against our diplomatic premises in Damascus, the Syrian Arab Republic, on the 1st of April, we notified the UN Security Council and Secretary General of such international wrongful act, as well as of Iran's inherent right under international law to respond to such terrorist armed attack. Also, in a phone conversation with the UN Secretary General on 2nd April, Iran Foreign Minister discussed the situation and called for taking appropriate action and a strong condemnation from the international community for this horrific crime. We called upon the Security Council to strongly denounce this unjustified criminal and terrorist act, taking decisive and appropriate measures to bring the perpetrators to justice swiftly and prevent the recurrence of such horrible crime against the diplomatic premises of any member state. Regrettably, the Security Council has failed in its duty to maintain international peace and security. Russia proposed a press statement to denounce this atrocious act, which was backed by China, Algeria, and many members, but was blocked by the US, UK, and France. Faced with such circumstances, the Islamic Republic of Iran had no choice but to exercise its inherent right to self-defense under international law. Madam President, the root cause of the current situation are clear to all. From the start of the Israeli war against Palestinian people in Gaza, more than 34,000 civilians, 2/3 of them children and women, have been killed. All civilian infrastructures have been targeted and destroyed by Israel. Even humanitarian workers have not been immune from the military attacks of this rough regime. The absence of accountability and conscious inaction faced with the Israeli genocide and war crimes against the Palestinian people has only emboldened this regime to continue its violation unchecked. The US and its allies have blocked the Security Council for over 6 months, protecting Israel from accountability for the Gaza massacre. They not only avoid condemning Israel for these atrocities, but also actively try to
Oh,
cover
you have the
them.
spicy German sounds?
Sole priority is supporting and
pretty good.
defending Israel regardless of the consequences and at all costs. Despite international pressure and UN Security Council resolution calling
Are you
for a
watching these
ceasefire,
Spanish shows?
Israel
What?
has
Are
defied
you listening to
this
these Spanish
resolution.
shows?
Rather, its focus
It's like,
remains
I know a
on
word.
committing
I say
more
words. I know.
atrocious crime showing no regard for international legal obligation. Madam President, this lawless regime has committed many atrocious crimes against our people. This regime blatantly and openly admitted its responsibility for the terrorist and destructive operation committed against Iranian officials, scientists, and civilians, and sabotage against our peaceful nuclear infrastructure in recent years. This Israeli regime even made explicit threats to use nuclear weapons against a sovereign member state of the United Nations. This terrorist regime is responsible for all criminal and terrorist acts committed against Iran and must bear the consequences. The Islamic Republic of Iran has warned time and again about the repercussions of the malicious activities of the regime on regional and international peace and security. Iran has exercised maximum restraint. Now it is time for the occupying regime to bear full responsibility for its consequences. This regime cannot avoid accountability. Madam President, Israel's ongoing destabilized and irresponsible action and atrocities against the nation in the region are a real threat to regional and international peace and security. The Israeli Prime Minister's policy seeks to expand and escalate the conflict in the region to stay in power. The member of the Security Council must not allow such an august body, the Security Council, to be held hostage to the ambitions of such a belligerent regime. It is time for the Security Council to shoulder its responsibility and address the real threat to international peace and security. The Security Council must promptly fulfill its duty under Chapter 7 of the Charter in response to Israeli reckless defiance. It must take urgent and punitive measures to compel this regime to stop its genocide and massacre against the people of Gaza and uphold its obligation, especially fully implement the UN Security Council resolution and legally binding orders of the International Court of Justice. The main and long-standing threat to the peace and security of our region is well known to all, and the attempts to conceal it through disinformation, a smear campaign, or base-based accusation against others are pointless and unfounded. Iran is never seeking to contribute to the spillover of the conflict in the region, nor does it to escalate or spread the tension to the entire region. Contrary to unfounded claims, Iran has no proxy in the region. No individual, group, or country act at the Iran behest. The US and Israeli regime attempt to label the resistance group in the region as proxies or terrorists. Their sinister aim is only to justify and legalize their malicious and destabilized activities in the region. The resistance group are not proxies or terrorists. They are legitimate and are only fighting against the occupation and aggression of Israel in Gaza and occupied Palestine territories and of the US in the region. International law recognized such legitimate rights against any occupation and aggression. Instead, the US and the UK are fully responsible for all its decades-long aggressions and other crimes and unlawful measures in our region. Furthermore, they are responsible for all crimes of the Israeli regime, as it cannot commit any of such savage crimes in Gaza without the consent, order, and all-out political, financial, and military support of and a collaboration with the United States and the UK. We reject the allegation made by the Israeli regime at this meeting Such false and unfounded claims don't merit to response. Madam President, as a responsible member of the United Nations, the Islamic Republic of Iran is committed to the purpose and principles enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations, reaffirms once more its commitment to the maintenance of international peace and security. The Islamic Republic of Iran reiterates its consistent position that it does not seek escalation or war in the region, while warning about any further military provocation by the Israeli regime. The Islamic Republic of Iran reaffirms its unwavering determination to defend its people, national security and interest, sovereignty and territorial integrity against any threat or act of aggression, and to respond to any such threat or aggression vigorously and in accordance with international law. The Islamic Republic of Iran will not hesitate to exercise this right when required. Madam President, Excellencies, Iran has no intention of engaging in conflict with the US in the region. We demonstrated our commitment to peace by exercising our restraint about involving the US Army in intercepting Iranian drones and missiles bound for military targets in the occupied Palestinian territories. This underscores our dedication to de-escalating tension and avoiding the expansion of conflict. However, if the US initiate military operation against Iran, its citizen, or its security and interest, Iran will use its inherent right to respond proportionately. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran and pass the floor to the Syrian Arab Republic.
Shukran, Sayyid.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, what our region witnessed yesterday is a natural and inevitable outcome of repeated aggressions and grave violations of international law and the United Nations Charter perpetrated by the Israeli occupation authorities on the territories of my country, Syria, and other countries. In that, these authorities were taking advantage of the support offered by the U.S. administration in this council and elsewhere. This American support, this blind and unlimited American support, has led the occupation authorities to mistakenly believe that they are above the United Nations and above international law and above the conventions and the resolutions that were adopted by our organization for decades. The support led these authorities to believe that they can continue perpetrating their crimes and their escalation of the situation in our region with no response and no consequence. My country, the Syrian Arab Republic, has warned the Security Council and the Secretariat repeatedly in official letters, warned of the dangers of an escalation, of the explosion that the Israeli occupation authorities are trying to spark to cover up for their military failure in Gaza and to find justifications for it to continue its genocide and other atrocities against the Palestinian people and the accompanying hysterical attacks on countries in the region. In our letters, we have repeatedly called upon the United Nations and the Security Council to take immediate action in accordance with their mandate. However, the U.S. administration and a number of its allies have obstructed any movement by the Security Council to shoulder its responsibility in the maintenance of international peace and security and putting an end to Israel's crimes and holding it accountable. The behavior of these countries is nothing new. These countries have prevented for over 7.5 decades the United Nations from shouldering its responsibility to put an end to the Israeli occupation of occupied Arab territories and to return legitimate Arab rights that are inherent to those who hold them, and in accordance with relevant United Nations resolutions, at the forefront of which are resolutions 242, 338, and 497. These resolutions are the basic foundation and the essence of a resolution to the Arab-Israeli conflict and the best means to deal with the repercussions of the Israeli occupation on the region, including the crises and challenges that it entailed. Syria holds the Israeli occupation authorities and the U.S. administration fully responsible for the Israeli attacks and any additional escalation that threatens peace and security in the region. Syria stresses that our region has suffered enough from the violations perpetrated by the Zionist entity and the U.S. administration and its allies, violations of international law and the principles and purposes of the Charter. The time has come to take serious action where these states reconsider their destructive policies in our region and against our peoples. The time has come for these states to immediately and unconditionally rectify these policies, including through imposing an immediate halt to the Israeli aggression on the Palestinian people and countries in the region. The states must guarantee full and unimpeded humanitarian access, and they must put an end to the intentional starving of the people of Gaza. Moreover, there must be an end to the illegitimate military presence of U.S. forces on the territory of my country, Syria. We must put an end to the systemic looting of our national wealth. We must put a stop to the sponsoring of terrorist organizations and separatist militias. We demand a full and unconditional removal of the unilateral coercive measures, which in themselves are a form of economic terrorism and collective punishment that the Syrian people must be freed of. Madam President, we have listened to the statements delivered by some Western delegations, which have once again expressed their approach of hypocrisy and double standards. Some members of this council have grown used to offering their own interpretations of the Charter and use them to serve their own goals and greed, including Article 51, which guarantees a basic right for all our states, namely the legitimate right to self-defense. The United States of America and Britain and France have launched repeated aggressions on my country, which is thousands of miles away from them. These three countries attacked my country collectively and individually based on a distorted interpretation of Article 51 and flimsy claims that are no more than baseless lies. They did not stop at that. Rather, they prevented the Security Council from discussing these attacks and from taking any action to uphold the principles of the Charter that these states are trying to replace with what they call a rules-based order. What the Islamic Republic of Iran did yesterday is a sound and practical exercise of the legitimate right to self-defense, as envisaged by the founding fathers of our organization and as guaranteed by Article 51 of the Charter. The Iranian response was an urgent necessity imposed by the Israeli occupation authorities' persistent crimes and hostile behavior. It was imposed by the fact that the three Western states who are permanent members of the Security Council have continued to obstruct the Security Council from taking any action to put an end to these violations or even simply condemn them. This was clearly manifest in the fact that the United States, France, and Britain obstructed the issuance by the Security Council of a press statement that condemns the Israeli terrorist attack against the Iranian consulate in the Syrian capital, Damascus, which was a clear violation of all international conventions and rules which guarantee the inviolability and immunity of diplomatic premises and personnel. And what else is to be expected from those who, along with their allies in the NATO, barbarically shelled the Chinese embassy in Belgrade in 1999? In closing, Madam President, On the 25th of April, 1945, the San Francisco Conference inaugurated its proceedings, laying the groundwork for the United Nations and the Charter, which is the guiding star for our collective action. And in the Charter were basic principles that confirm the need to respect sovereignty and equality between member states regardless of their size. Today, and more than ever before, our countries must uphold these principles, because upholding them means the success of the United Nations and its mandate, and violating them means dismissing the rule of law and replacing it with the law of the jungle, with wars, and with instability. Syria is a founding member of the United Nations and continues to believe in this organization, in its principles, in its purposes. And we wish for it to undertake its role in maintaining international peace and security and in dealing with the root causes of the challenges that our country is facing, namely the Israeli occupation, which is an impediment to the peace and security in our countries and the prosperity of our peoples. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.
Goodies, if you will, provided to Israel as it continues to carry its genocide in Gaza. So as Israel tries to, quote, compromise, unquote, on the issue of Iran and retaliation, it will be gaining more and more support, protection, and finance to carry its occupation and its genocide in Palestine.
All right, Marwan, thanks for that. Marwan Bashar, our senior political analyst. Thanks a lot. Let's head over live now to occupied East Jerusalem. Rory Chalmers is standing by for us there. And Rory, with all this going on, decisions, or at least further steps, are being talked about within the Israeli war cabinet. Where have they got to, do you know?
Well, that's a big question. Obviously, the War Cabinet and the Security Cabinet have been meeting this evening in Tel Aviv, in Israel, and they haven't, as far as we're aware, yet come to a decision about whether they're going to strike back against Iran. If they do, what form that kind of retaliation might take. Now, I think that indecision is a reminder of a couple of things. It's a reminder of the high stakes that we're in at the moment because of this unfolding situation. It's also a reminder of the different personalities, the different perspectives at play in the higher echelons of Israel's decision-making structures. You've got a wily political operator in the form of Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister. You've got sort of grizzled, hard-bitten military men, Yoav Gallant and Benny Gantz. And you've got these firebrand, ultra-nationalist, far-right politicians, Ben Gvir and Smotrich. Ben Gvir even tweeted out on X earlier on this evening that if Iran was ever going to be deterred in the Middle East, then the boss, as he put it, had to go nuts. But when we've got through all of that, we essentially have, the War Cabinet is the organisation that makes the decisions, and there are only 3 people on that actually do the deciding. That's Benjamin Netanyahu, and that is Yoav Gallant, and that's Benny Gantz. And as far as we're aware, they haven't come to a decision yet.
Rory, we're getting reports that a drone has been fired from Yemen towards Israel. Are you hearing anything about this?
Yeah, I mean, the Israeli military has been speaking about it. They've called it a suspicious aerial object, and they say that it came into Israeli air territory from the Red Sea and in the region of Eilat, which is down on that Red Sea coast. an Israeli warship, a corvette, used the Iron Dome battery that's mounted on the warship. The naval version of the Iron Dome is called Sea Dome, and they engaged it and they shot it down. Now, the belief is that it came from the Yemen direction. That's what's being reported in Israeli media. It's also being reported that this is only the second time that an aerial object has been successfully engaged by this naval version of the Iron Dome, the Sea Dome that's mounted on these ships.
All right, Rory, thanks for that. Rory Challenge there in occupied East Jerusalem. Well, G7 leaders have condemned Iran's strike on Israel, saying it risks provoking an uncontrollable regional escalation. The leaders held a video conference and in a statement afterwards said they're working to try and stabilize the situation in the Middle East. Earlier, US President Joe Biden met with his national security advisors and he reaffirmed what he calls America's ironclad commitment to Israel's security. Let's speak now to Ali Vaez, who's the International Crisis Group's Iran Project Director. He's with us live now from Washington, D.C. Ali, welcome to Al Jazeera. First up, as we were discussing earlier with our senior political analyst, Moran Bashara, all this will have been thoroughly calculated all the way through. Israel will have anticipated what was coming from Iran after it bombed the consulate in Syria. How now do you think Iran will be second-guessing how Israel may or may not retaliate?
Well, I think the Iranian strike was designed in a way that it was very flashy, but was also aimed at causing no fatalities, because Iran knew that if there are fatalities, then it would trigger an escalation that could suck the United States into a confrontation with Iran, and that's the last thing that the Islamic Republic wanted. But at the same time, I think the Prime Minister Netanyahu's government, with the strike on April 1st on Iranian consulate, put itself in a win-win situation in the sense that if Iran were to not respond, of course, Israel could weaken Iran's regional deterrence and get away with it. And if Iran would respond, then they were hoping that it would create a situation that would result in expansion of the conflict or put the United States in direct confrontation with Iran. Well, none of those things have happened as of yet, and we have to see, the ball is in Israel's court. We have to see how Israel is going to respond. But the risk for Israel is if it targets Iran on its own soil, so retaliation in kind, it could trigger a strike on Israel that would not be as carefully calibrated and would also bring Hezbollah, the tip of the spear of Iran's regional network, into the fray. And that would, of course, result in a catastrophic war, which would have no winners.
You are in the United States. How are you perceiving the administration there views the current situation? They've condemned Iran's attacks, but are calling for restraint.
Look, I think the Biden administration played an important role in trying to prevent further expansion of the conflict through direct and indirect messaging with Iran, which helped basically prepare for the Iranian strike. And the U.S., in addition to trying to deter a Iranian attack that would result in the kind of response that would be inevitable from the United States, also defended Israel and saved lives. So I think they treaded a very difficult needle. But of course, we're not out of the woods yet. And with the proximate cause of all of these tensions being the war in Gaza still ongoing, there is a possibility of round 2 and 3 of these kind of tit-for-tats, which at any point could spiral out of control.
Indeed. Ali, that's all we've got time for. We'll leave it there. Do appreciate your perspective. Ali Vaez there from the International Crisis Group in Washington, D.C. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Let's move on to some other news. And it is 10 years to the day since 276 schoolgirls were kidnapped from their school in northern Nigeria. Dozens of the girls remain missing after their abduction by Boko Haram fighters. No one has ever been charged for the crime, which made headlines.
With the comedy and the ghosts.
You said it changed your life being in it.
It really did.
You're a dedicated communications department to sort of provide the official narrative to the press. So this takes the form of like press conferences, press releases, photo ops. Basically, if you're the government or you're a corporation, you have an unlimited amount of resources that you can spend on crafting the narrative that you want to get in the media. And of course, if you are the media, if you're a news outlet, you actually have a pretty limited set of resources to do investigative journalism. So that means that the press stuff, the quote official narrative from the companies and the government is always going to dominate, right? So closely related to that is the fourth filter, the idea of flack as a means of disciplining the media. So this is like another component of the PR apparatus whereby when the media, puts out an unflattering story or, says something that a company or a politician doesn't like, they have an infrastructure in place to respond. And to just give one example, when I worked at the New Republic, every time I wrote a critical article about Amazon or about, this or that politician, immediately I would get a badgering and or threatening email from their press department, from their communications department, or from their legal department being like, well, you should really consider that, like, actually, Jeff Bezos has put X, Y, and Z safety mechanisms into Amazon warehouses. And the point here is like not that my articles were like so dangerous or something. They weren't like investigative journalism. Honestly, like to be honest, like nobody was reading my articles at the New Republic. It's just that all of these places have entire departments whose entire job is to respond to, is to monitor the Google alerts basically, right? And respond to any kind of negative press that they come across. So that's the fourth filter. And then the last filter is an ideological one. And when Herman and Chomsky wrote the book, which was in 1988, this is obviously on the eve of the fall of the Berlin Wall. So they identified this ideological filter as anti-communism. And I believe in recent years, they have updated that to war on terror, or they've said things like, well, you can replace anti-communism with war on terror, or even just free market at this point, right? As sort of the like underlying ideological apparatus that shapes a lot of media narrative that we hear. And so I just want to quickly run through the propaganda model, because I think the interesting thing about manufacturing consent, and specifically about this model in particular, is these are all structural and economic forces. So Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman, we're not saying that there's like a giant 1984 TV that just like blaring the same message at people. I think that they're also not saying that Rupert Murdoch or like whoever runs the New York Times are these like evil puppet masters who are just like willfully disseminating lies in order to like turn a quick buck. Although obviously like those people exist. And I think that they're actually very generous about individual journalists as well, perhaps more so than we would be, right? Like they are very clear that lots of journalists who go into the field, actually, as you mentioned, Matt, like think that they are doing good, or like actually are well intentioned or have noble intentions, but these are structural forces that shape the media and shape how we.
Welcome back to the Michael Brooks Show.
And then there's the contract situation of Brandon Ayuk. Remember yesterday? I don't know if do we have that Instagram story post with John Lynch is like, hey, listen, we'd love to re-sign him long term. There's a 5th-year option for us as well. They obviously would pick that up while trying to renegotiate a long-term deal. And they're also saying, hey, we're used to re-signing our own. Remember, Deebo Samuel looked like he was history, and he's not. He's still on the team. So Brandon Ayuk, I guess hearing those comments, 5 emojis, money, and then the talking emoji, the bull emoji, the poop emoji, and the walking emoji.
Happy Sunday, and here we go again. According to numerous reports, Brandon Ayuk has requested a trade from the San Francisco 49ers. This is how I imagine we got to this point. The 49ers approached Ayuk about a contract extension.
And Joe Biden, he's really the only one in the whole entire world that has the power to stop this, say within the next hour. Literally, by just turning off the faucet, pulling the plug. No more bombs, no more guns, no more bullets, no more nothing until you, Mr. Netanyahu, stop the slaughter. And we're the bank for this, folks, you and me, how much we give each year. Collectively, it's a lot of money. And President Biden, you have to do your part. Why are you risking having even 10,000 people not show up who are just deciding, they've already decided they're not going to vote because of this? Hillary lost Michigan by 10,000 votes. Don't make the same mistake. Please.
You just listened to a snippet from Michael Moore's latest podcast where he pleads with Biden to stop supporting Netanyahu's genocide in Gaza because doing so could literally cost him the election in November. Now, he goes on to make not just a political argument, but he also tries to appeal to Biden's sense of morality and Catholicism, saying, quote, "You know who you are and what you have to do. You must have thought it. You must have thought about it during Mass on Easter. Public opinion is completely against this ethnic cleansing." And he goes on to add, "It's been just an awful thing for all of us to be witness to. We'd like to think about it because our president, the one that has to stop Trump from winning in November, is the #1 financial backer and the #1 arms dealer for the state of Israel. So what do we do with that?" Yeah, and what he's saying here is particularly important after 48,000 people in Wisconsin voted uncommitted on Tuesday's primary, a state that Biden won in 2020 with just 20,000 more votes than Trump. And this comes as a Wall Street Journal poll finds that he's neck and neck with Trump in the state. But that same poll also shows that Biden is losing to Trump in every other key swing state. Pennsylvania by 3, Nevada by 4, Michigan by 3, North Carolina by 6, Arizona by 5, and Georgia by 1. And aggregate national polls show that Trump is narrowly leading Biden overall. Now, to be clear, Biden isn't trailing Trump because people are flipping and voting for Trump instead. He's trailing Trump because large portions of his own base are planning to stay home because they are disillusioned with his unwavering support for Israel. And ahead of Tuesday's vote, MSNBC reporter Maya Eaglin spoke to students in Wisconsin about why they're choosing to cast protest votes. And here's what they had to say.
We've seen tens of thousands of primary voters cast uncommitted votes throughout the country already. Over 89,000 in Washington, 52,000 in Colorado, and 101,000 in Michigan. And the young voters I spoke with in Wisconsin are organizing another wave of these protest votes through the Unconstructed movement to voice their disappointment with Biden's response to the war in Gaza. Take a look.
Wisconsinites have had enough.
Hala Ahmed is a Palestinian American and the Listen to Wisconsin spokesperson. Their campaign officially kicked off in Milwaukee on March 19th.
I think the Democratic Party has lost all legitimacy in our communities.
The campaign's goal is to get at least 20,000 people in Wisconsin to vote uninstructed, which means uncommitted or choosing no candidate. That number is roughly the same number of votes that won Biden the state in the 2020 general election.
If in November we still don't have a ceasefire, I don't know what will be left in Gaza. And that's our focus in this campaign.
A March Gallup poll found that 55% of Americans disapprove of Israel's military action in Gaza. But that number is even higher at 63% when looking at just voters between the ages of 18 and 34. Another young voter involved in the Uninstructed movement is 22-year-old Dalia Saba.
This is a campaign that's being run by students and by young people who really care about this.
Saba has family in Gaza and says organizing protest efforts in Wisconsin allows her to feel empowered.
Joe Biden has already won the Democratic nomination, so the Uninstructed campaign is really a way of sending a message. It is not about him actually becoming president or not. It is a way for us to quantify, this is how many people care about this issue. We are Democrats, we're voting in the Democratic primary. These are your constituents, and your policy is alienating them.
I feel like this is obvious, but if voters in swing states like Wisconsin and Michigan really do choose to stay home and Biden does lose them permanently, Trump wins. And if that happens, Biden and Biden alone will be the one to blame because their message couldn't be more clear. Stop supporting genocide or lose their votes. And down-ballot Democrats are also worried that Biden's support for Israel could cost them their elections as well, and they're right to be worried because this is deeply, deeply troubling to people. They are morally outraged that our government is supporting this. That is a legitimate concern. And Michael Moore isn't the only celebrity that's telling Biden to take concerns of these voters seriously, because Democratic Party loyalists like Sunny Hostin, who has loyally supported the Democratic Party for years, is also saying what Michael Moore is saying. Take these voters seriously. Do not take them for granted. Let's watch.
You know, I don't think that you can tell people whose families have been killed, whole entire lines of their families have been murdered, over 32,000 people, women and children, the majority, that, well, but if Trump wins, it would be better. The problem here is that it would be worse. The problem here is that they are making themselves known. Michigan has about 200,000 Muslim voters. They are losing their family members, and the United States, the UN has found, is complicit in that. And that is because the United States sends $3.8 billion worth of aid to Israel, and that also includes arming them. Social scientists have found that if the United States stopped providing that aid, the war would be over. Let me just finish this. The war would be over in 3 days.
And she's right. That's why people are leveraging their votes to get Biden to stop. But the problem is the Democratic Party elites tend to just disregard what their own base wants. This isn't the first time that they've done it, and I'm sure it won't be the last. And I say this because Sunny Hostin was actually responding to this comment from Hillary Clinton on Jimmy Fallon's show.
What do you say to voters who are upset that those are the two choices?
Get over yourself. Those are the two choices.
Yeah, love that.
Right?
Now, it's easy for her to say that as a warmonger and fellow supporter of Israel's genocide, but the problem is no amount of scolding voters is going to persuade them to vote for you. Hillary, of all people, should know this, since her hubris is in part why Trump became president in the first place. But Stephen A. Smith was actually asked about her comments, and I think that he did a perfect job at articulating everything that I wanted to say about this, and then
It is June 1889 and a country is in shock. An entire community has been washed away and 2,209 people are feared dead. A dam has failed, sending a deluge downstream. The event would become one of the country's worst disasters and would be the measuring stick in which all future tragedies would be compared against. The event would permeate itself into the American psyche and leave behind haunting images of death, destruction, and the thought that at any moment everything you know and love could come to an end. Today we're looking at the Johnstown flood.
Chanting Genocide Joe. Now, that was our phrase on the left, right? Those of us that attended the protests, the pro-Palestinian protests, that's been our phrase. But now everybody's starting to see it. Everyone's starting to see it. See it for yourself.
Is a big problem.
Genocide Joe! Genocide Joe! Genocide Joe! Genocide Joe! Genocide Joe! Genocide Joe! Genocide Joe!
They're not wrong.
They're not wrong. He's
You see
done
that?
everything wrong. Think he is.
So you guys see what's happening?
By the way, how do you guys like the new style of thumbnail for live streams? Just let me know. It's a bit of a different style that I was trying out on this live stream. That way it could differentiate videos a little bit too, so they don't all look the same.
We'll all remember the day that O.J. Simpson died. We'll all remember where we were the day O.J. died. Gentlemen, I know it's sort of sad to come on the mic, to lose one of the greats. And I'll say this about O.J. No matter whether you think he's guilty or innocent, he didn't murder anyone else in the time he's since been acquitted. He did not murder anyone else or was even accused of murdering anyone else. So I think we should keep that in mind.
That's a really good point. I've
Yeah.
never heard anyone acknowledge that. It's like, look, if he definitely murdered, he would have gone for seconds or thirds. Especially when he was like doing other crimes, like he did an armed robbery. You'd think he'd be like, oh, while I'm here, I should kill somebody, but he didn't. When I said that, like there were things that he did that I didn't agree with, everyone assumed I was talking about, allegedly killing his wife and her boyfriend. I meant playing football. I think football's boring. We don't know if
Naked
he
Gun
killed
films,
anyone.
the Naked Gun movies,
Yeah.
no one can ever take Nordberg away from him.
Yeah. No, that's unimpeachable. Everyone who was born in 2014, check out the Naked Gun movies.
I think that this actually opens up a very interesting question, which is that is the proper reform and restorative justice practice to not send people to jail after they kill their wives and their wives' boyfriends? Didn't that work? It prevented him from ever doing it again. Because if we had sent him to jail for it and then he got out of jail, he might have killed again.
Yeah, a lot of people don't know this, but when the Goldman family won that lawsuit against him, they made him do like rehabilitation worksheets and like statements of harm. They made him do like Chaz stuff to rehabilitate. And it fixed him.
Yeah, I mean, like, why send someone to jail when you can just send them on Cameron and Mace's podcast? I mean, like, talk about hey, if they're looking for a third mic to comment on sports now that Uncle OJ is gone, Mace, Cameron, give me a call.
I mean, I'm willing to go further than that. I am willing to run through an airport in a way that surprises an old lady in order to sell a food product or a type of insurance.
I'll never smile again until I smile at you. I'll never laugh again.
He was born Jan Ludwig Hyman Benjamin Hock to an Orthodox Jewish family in Czechoslovakia in 1923. His parents were farm laborers, and he grew up in poverty with 9 siblings. His overriding memories of childhood were hunger pains and how much he loved his mother. When the Nazi war machine swept through his part of Europe, he escaped and fled to France. He helped organize an underground escape route for other Czechs, and he fought for the army in exile. He adopted a new name that he took from a cigarette brand, Yvon de Maurier. He learned English in 6 weeks, and he joined the British Army in time to fight at Normandy. He led raids into Nazi-occupied territory. Once, he threatened to level an entire German village if the Nazi troops there didn't surrender, and he killed the mayor they sent to negotiate as a demonstration of his resolve. His commanding officer filed a glowing report about him that read, "His sense of duty is outstanding, and his desire to kill Huns is a driving force." Field Marshal Montgomery would pin a military cross to his uniform in 1945. By the time the Reich was collapsing, almost all his family had died in the Holocaust. He never really had friends. He collected acquaintances and people who might prove useful to him. They describe a man who was never entirely sure of who he was, who adopted a multitude of different personalities, who constructed walls between different parts of his life. He told contradictory stories about his past. He did not regret the killings that he committed during the war. He did not regret looting corpses or running black market swag. He was multilingual, and the British Army recognized him as a quick thinker and a canny operator. And he was attached to the Foreign Office press section in 1945 and deployed to Berlin. The Foreign Office immediately concluded that he was some kind of double agent, but for whom they weren't exactly sure, although they suspected the Soviets. It didn't ultimately matter because he was also an asset for British intelligence, and eventually he would be an asset for the CIA and for Mossad. He made his money in academic publishing, using his contacts in the Allied occupation authorities to work an angle where he'd buy scientific journals and papers for next to nothing, most of them sourced from the Soviet Union, and he'd sell them at a high markup in the West. He used the profits from this to buy 3/4 of a publishing house called Butterworth Springer, which he renamed Pergamon Press. He told people he spent time in a military hospital with Ronald Reagan during the war, or that he'd been born in Scotland, or that he sold the contents of the House of Commons wine cellar for £25,000. One of these stories is actually true. When he proposed to his wife Elizabeth, who he met in France in 1944, he told her, "I shall win a military cross. I will make my fortune. I will recreate my family, and I will become Prime Minister of Britain."
Match
He
found.
viewed women as naturally subordinate to men, and he made a point of mistreating Elizabeth, who tried to understand his mercurial temperament and violent outbursts by educating herself about the Holocaust. She discovered the Nazis had actually killed almost 300 members of his extended family. They had 9 children. One died of leukemia, and another never regained consciousness after a car crash. Elizabeth said that much of his life was spent trying to recreate the family he'd had in Czechoslovakia, and trying to recreate himself as something other than what he was. It was impossible to know for sure, because he rarely expressed how he felt about concepts like family, or love, or friendship, and so much of what he said contradicted so many other things that he'd said. When he visited the tiny village where he'd been born, The locals gave him a hero's welcome. During a visit to Auschwitz, he was overcome by the horror of the Nazi death machine, and he was inconsolable for days afterwards. He made his money in publishing, but the books in his various homes were all empty cardboard sleeves. He regarded almost everybody that he encountered with a deep, acidic contempt. By the 1980s, his business empire would extend from Britain to Europe, America, Asia, and Africa. He was awarded the Order of the White Rose of Finland. When he was at the office, he would take a shit with the bathroom door open so that his secretaries would be subjected to a sensory overload of sound and smell. To impress journalists, he would instruct underlings to burst into the room mid-interview, saying the President of the United States was on the phone,
Their team has a
urgently
healer
seeking his
too,
advice.
but you won't be enough.
Sometimes they were telling the truth. He claimed socialist politics, but he would piss off the roof of his newspaper's headquarters onto the people in the street below. He loved to fight with trade union leaders, and he would eventually steal upwards of £491 million from his staff's pension funds. He collected friends in politics, particularly the Labour Party. Neil Kinnock, the Labour Party leader, hated and feared him. The emerging generation of politicians, the ones who'd go on to plan the New Labour project, admired his ability to pay lip service to leftist principles while behaving in exactly the opposite way. He was a formative influence on future Blairite all-stars like Peter Mandelson, Gordon Brown, and Alistair Campbell. A future Labour MP called Helen Liddell worked as public affairs director at two papers that he owned, the Daily Record and the Sunday Mail. He described her as his eyes and ears in Scotland. He was a tyrant and a bully who humiliated his employees and delighted in terrorising and publicly humiliating his sons Ian and Kevin. The British establishment considered him a loudmouth clown and a peasant. Press criticism of him was shot through with xenophobia and anti-Semitism. He detested the English aristocracy, their parochial dullness, their incestuous social circles, their dull-witted children. He craved their acceptance all the same. He became a Labour MP in 1964, and the Queen of England named her noisiest and most aggressive corgi Maxwell after him. He truly loved only one of his children, his youngest daughter. He named his yacht the Lady Ghislaine in her honour. He had a stained glass window depicting himself as Samson installed at his mansion in Oxford, Headington Hill Hall. His daughter inherited his strange sense of humour. After his death, she was frequently snapped by paparazzi on a yacht called the Octopus. She hung devil masks in her house and toy skeletons in her closets. He expanded his portfolio to include Macmillan Publishing, the British Printing Corporation, and the Mirror News Group. By the 1980s, he owned half of MTV in Europe, and he was in the third decade of a war with Rupert Murdoch, whom he hated with an awesome, white-hot intensity. He was fascinated by technology and revolutionary capabilities of computers. He invested in advanced instrumentation modules based at St. Mary's in Cambridge, but he refused to invest any more in the venture unless he was given total control of AI. 15 years later, when Sinclair Research was on the verge of bankruptcy, he made a bid to save it. One of his big ideas was to offload Sinclair's stockpile of unsold QL computers to the Soviets. The computer software division of his Mirror Group, Mirrorsoft, would eventually become entangled in a ferocious tug-of-war over the distribution rights to Tetris. Tetris wouldn't be the only app that he tried to profit from in the 1980s.
Can someone get this?
For all his sense of alienation inside a ruined class he spent the first half of his life breaking into, he maintained a Rolodex of powerful contacts who were always eager to do him a favour, at least until his final years. He hosted lavish parties at Headington, attended by sheiks and dukes and MPs and royalty and celebrities and whoever else might prove useful. Margaret Thatcher considered him an impressive if obnoxious figure. Ronald Reagan sent him telegrams on his birthday. He was pictured at Malcolm Forbes' 70th birthday party in Morocco with Elizabeth Taylor. He was pictured shaking Queen Elizabeth's hand in 1983 while Ghislaine stood close by. the broadcaster David Frost gave him a £500 bottle of wine to celebrate Pergamon's 40th anniversary. The Headington Hall chef used it to make beef stew. The banker was Sir Michael Richardson, who was the managing director of Rothschild Bank and Thatcher's economic advisor. After his death, the Lady Galen would be sold on and rechristened the Dancing Hare. In one of those strange twists that seem to haunt this entire series, the Dancing Hare wound up being owned by Anna Murdoch, Rupert's ex-wife. Disquieting rumours about his connections to the intelligence underworld surfaced every so often, and he tried his best to clamp down on them with threats of legal action. He was said to have worked with Mossad to plan the kidnapping of an Israeli nuclear scientist and whistleblower in 1986. He bought the Lady Galen from Iman Khashoggi, who's the nephew of deep state operative Adnan. He told his Mossad handlers they should start using psychics to find potential terrorists. He kept the British government informed of events inside the Soviet Union during the coup attempt of 1991. He was given something very close to a state
enemy remaining.
Israel in November
Spike
of the
down,
same
attacker
year.
spawn.
6 heads of Mossad were in attendance. The Israeli Prime Minister gave a flowery eulogy in which he said, "He has done more for Israel than today can be told." People who knew him say that for all his larger-than-life presence, rooms somehow seemed emptier when he entered them. The air seemed colder. Conversations grew strained. He was the great blank spot at the centre of every social function. A loud, aggressive, overbearing nothing. Harold Wilson, the ex-Labour Prime Minister, once tried to make a speech in his honour at Headington Hall, but his Alzheimer's caused him to forget who he was talking about, which the guests say infuriated the host. There was a sense from the people who thought they knew him that nothing he achieved meant much to him, and that the obsessive collecting of Rolls Royces and penthouses and mansions and mistresses was really all just a way of reassuring himself that he existed. They say he was driven by greed and resentment and an all-consuming fear that he wasn't quite real. They recall how he would walk around parties with his own portable PA system so everybody could hear him speak. He took his final name from a brand of instant coffee. Disintegration defines his story. From the day the Nazis annihilated his family, to the collapse of his business empire, to what became of his children, to the night he vanished from the Lady Galen,
One
and was
enemy
fished
remaining.
out of the ocean shortly afterwards. He was Robert Maxwell. Somehow, Robert Maxwell never really existed.
Thank you. We cannot let them unweave our world.
I had a dream about this place. Then I realized what it is. There's a man. I can see him through the wall. Who's next? I can see his face. I hope that I never see that face outside of a dream.
We've reached a point in the series now where we have to start relying a little more on instinct and informed supposition, I suppose you could call it, to try and find a way through the murk, because we are closer than ever to the seafloor here, and the dark is pressing in on all sides. And much of what's known or suspected about Robert Maxwell's role in the Promised Story mostly comes by way of those spooks and con men that we've been talking about.
One enemy remaining. Last player standing.
Facts blur with fever dreams and the self-mythologization of underworld operatives. So let's consider this blurriness. Back at the start of the series, we told the story of how in 19 1983, when Dr. Ben Orr visited the Inslaw offices for a demonstration of promise. And then in 1992, Bill Hamilton and Dean Merrill, who was the former vice president of Inslaw, they were shown 6 photographs of different men by congressional investigators, and they were asked to identify Ben Orr from this mugshot lineup. The one they picked was a snap of Rafi Eitan, who was the Israeli spy master. Now, it was already known by 92 that while Dr. Orr never bought promise from Inslaw on the day of the demonstration at their offices, he did swing by the Department of Justice later that year, in May, and he left with a copy of the enhanced version of the software in a briefcase. The Department of Justice had also shared copies of what we've been calling enhanced promise with the NSA and the CIA. The NSA, in turn, had started selling a bugged copy of the software to banks as part of the Reagan admin's follow the money policy. And they used it to track money sent from the West to the Soviet Union, and, among other things. So this means that Eitan and the US intelligence community had access to the software before the Department of Justice even really started putting the screws to Bill Hamilton and his company. And a memo from a Justice Department official called Jack Rue, written in April of 1983, says, quote, C. Madison Brick Brewer, Promise Project Manager at the Justice Department, recently instructed me to make a copy of an LEAA version of Promise, a version owned wholly by the Justice Department, available to Dr. Ben Orr, a representative of the government of Israel. Dr. Orr called me to discuss that request after my earlier memorandum was written. I have made a copy of the LENDEC version of Promise and will provide it along with the corresponding documentation to Dr. Orr before he leaves the United States for Israel on May the 16th. At some point then, between Eitan's theft of Enhanced Promise and the forced bankruptcy of Inslaw in 1985, Michael Riconosciuto claims that Earl Bryan hired him to install a secret trapdoor in the software so that spies could monitor the people using it and how they were using it. Ari Ben Menashe, who is the Israeli spook that we've mentioned before, he says that he hired a programmer in Northern California to install a trapdoor in the version of Promise the Israelis had obtained in 1983. Now, it's unclear whether this programmer was Michael Riconosciuto, but Ari Ben Menashe is clear that bugging and selling the software was a joint US-Israeli intelligence operation, and Mossad ran point from the scheme. And it's also unclear if the NSA bugged their copy of Promise independently of the CIA. Both agencies have long-standing rivalry, but they do coordinate very closely on especially sensitive operations, you know, particularly if, as with the theft of Promise, they inhabit a legal grey zone, to say the least. So we've already covered how it's likely that Michael Riconosciuto was actually taking credit for something he picked up through the underworld grapevine, you know. But it gets ever more fortunate, because Rafi Eitan, as the head of Israel's Lekem intelligence agency, is supposed to have hired some programmers of his own to install his version of a trapdoor in his copy of Promise around the tail end of 1983, independently of Rico and Ben Menashe and the NSA and the CIA. In Eitan's account, he alone is the one who came up with the idea of bugging Promise. And just as a reminder, so you have the original version of Promise, then you have the enhanced Promise, the one that Inslaw developed, you know, the second version they developed. Then you have the bugged version of Promise. And this is what Benghazi and I have been calling Spooky Promise. However, in Gordon Thomas's Gideon Spies, The Secret History of Mossad, Thomas reports that Eitan reckons he came into possession of Enhanced Promise at some point during the first Intifada, which means that he couldn't have had access to it any earlier than 1987 if he's telling the truth. And certainly, he could have had access to it no later than that either, because Lekem was disbanded that year. Thomas says that Earl Bryan supplied it directly to Eitan during one of his visits to Israel. And it was at this point that Eitan had his geeks install this trapdoor. So whether there was already another version of Promise with a trapdoor that had been installed by the Americans circulating at this point is unclear in this account. I tend to believe Bill Hamilton's story is probably the closest to the truth. So we'll go with a version that has Eitan getting hold of Promise in 1983, just for the sake of simplicity.
They're just batteries. So,
we have Inslaw's Enhanced Promise, which is stolen, bugged, and therefore turns into Spooky Promise. The chain of custody is very murky after 1983, so we have to bear in mind that there were possibly multiple copies of Spooky Promise with different modifications and features being sold around the world after 1985 or so. And this is because Eitan and Ben Menashe make claims about the Israeli modified version of Promise that suggest it wasn't exactly the same as the one the Americans were selling. This is from Gideon's Spies again. Quote, when Earl Bryan returned to the United States, Rafi Eitan put together a small team of former Lachem programmers. Now, dig that, former Lachem programmers. So, was it that they left Lachem, or was it that he was having them do this after Lachem had been disbanded? They deconstructed the Promise disc, rearranged its various components, then added several elements of their own. There was no way for anyone to be able to claim ownership of what Promise had become. Rafi Eitan decided to keep the original name because it was a good marketing tool to explain what the system was. I'll refer you back to what Benghazi mentioned in part 1 of the series, that Promise was part of a system of software packages, really. Promise was just one in a long line of Promise types. So this issue, how do we disentangle the timeline? How do we distinguish the original Enhanced Promise from its various descendants? What about the other programs that basically rip off Promise and add some nifty new abilities to it? This is something that we've been wrestling with from chapter 1.
You will not kill my ally.
Now, the discrepancies in these accounts of how Rafi Eitan and Mossad got hold of Promise are very interesting. And since we'll probably never know the day-for-day truth of it, there's actually more profit in thinking about why these discrepancies even exist. Like, who do they benefit, you know? Because for one, Eitan admitting to Gordon Thomas that he freely obtained the program from a US federal agency on US soil in 1983. That would implicate him and Department of Justice officials in something much bigger than the version where Earl Bryan just gives him a copy during one of his friendly meetings. Adding in that context about the Intifada maybe gives Eitan some additional moral or political justification for what he did. You know, at least in his mind. But that doesn't quite add up when you look at the affidavit that Gordon Thomas filed in the year 2000. Now, according to Thomas in that, Eitan felt that he was untouchable owing to his reputation and his advancing years. And this is why he offered to tell Thomas everything about Promise and Mossad in so much detail. He even said, unequivocally, that the CIA and British intelligence were using Spooky Promise supplied to them by Mossad, that Mossad was spying on them as well. And he also claimed that if there was any blowback, he'd just deny telling Gordon anything in the first place. This is from that affidavit. Quote, at all stages, Rafi was fully cooperative and at times a little boastful of his exploits. His frankness astonished me. He struck me as someone who was quite ready to speak openly because he felt he could face no problems later. He told me that the source of the computer software that Israeli intelligence modified for its anti-terrorism initiative was Earl Bryan. Bryan had discovered that the US Department of Justice was already using a modified version of the same software in order to track money laundering and other criminal activity. Bryan was angry when he learned about this application of the software in question. The clear implication of Rafi Eitan's statements to me was that Bryan believed he had an undisputed right to a personal financial gain from every use of modified versions of this software product. So check out the first 3 installments of this miniseries for more information about Earl Bryan.
We know the drill.
Eitan also sheds a little bit more light on how Promise, owing to Hamilton's skill as a software designer, how that could be adapted by different users to perform different tasks, you know. Quote, Rafi told me that the FBI, the Drug Enforcement Administration, and the CIA each made use of modified versions of Promise. The FBI to fight the mafia's money laundering and other criminal activities, the DEA to fight against the Colombian drug barons, and the CIA made Promise into a weapon every bit as effective as a spy satellite, according to him. Israel's Mossad conducted Promise-related espionage against the United States through Israel's embassy in Washington, D.C. And here again, we are faced with another maddening incongruity. Why would Rafi Eitan lie about when and how he obtained Promise, but casually admit that he'd been using it to spy on allied countries? And interestingly, Thomas also has Eitan saying that he'd first learned about the software in the late 1970s from Earl Bryan. So this means it's possible that Rafi posed as Dr. Ben Ort to obtain a copy of the enhanced version in 1983, you know, just to check it out. And maybe he did have Lechem install a bug and other modifications, but let's suppose that he was still unconvinced by it until the Intifada began and Bryan told him about all the different modifications that US spooks had been making to it through the 1980s. This might be closer to the money because Thomas also says, quote, Rafi Eitan told me that Earl Bryan's disclosures to him of US Justice Department's use of a modified version of Promise to track money laundering, combined with Earl Bryan's obvious determination to profit personally from any and all uses of modified versions of Promise, prompted Rafi Eitan to conceive of a new worldwide use of a modified version of the software tracking terrorists, and to involve Earl Bryan as a private businessman in the sale of this terrorist tracking version. Philip Ajiva, the CIA whistleblower, he claims that Israel was supplying the bugged version of Promise to state security services before Inslaw had even filed for bankruptcy, which, you know, this adds more weight to the notion that bugging and selling Promise was a US-Israeli deal that began in 1983.
The CIA will, in other words, be working with the security and intelligence services of other countries, and one way they're going to be doing it is through high technology. There's a book on the table back there by Ari Ben-Menashe. It just came out 3 weeks ago. It is called The Prophets of War. Ben-Menashe was an officer in the Israeli military intelligence service for 12 years. And he was involved at the highest level in some very, very interesting things. It is probably the most sensational book that's come out this year, although it is not receiving the proper attention it deserves in the U.S. information media. But Ben-Menashe, it's a very long story who he is and the controversy surrounding him for the last 2 or 3 years. But one of the things we owe to him is gratitude for having outlined how the Promise software developed by the Inslaw company was marketed around the world to intelligence and security services. What I was doing in the 60s was all by hand. It was before computers, or certainly before microcomputers, and the development of the software to make it all computerized. Ben-Menashe writes in his book how the Israelis got this program from Earl Bryan, the former Secretary of Health Services here in California during the Reagan period as governor. Bryan was marketing it around the world. The Israelis also marketed it around the world through another private, so-called private individual, i.e. Robert Maxwell, the tycoon who owned the Mirror interests in Britain. What happens is the Israelis provide this software to the Guatemalan government in 1984. What does this system do? It means that disparate databases can all be made to interface, and that the formats can be made compatible through this very high-tech advanced software. The Israelis and the CIA created trapdoors into this program. Trapdoors meaning a way through modems in which they could have access to the computers of the host intelligence or security service.
So we'll return to that partnership with Earl Bryan in a moment, but in the last episode we discussed the rise of the smoke and mirrors world of counterterrorism and the way that this was something like a new religion for a lot of political and intelligence operatives all through the 70s and 80s, as it became increasingly obvious that the Soviets just weren't going to be useful as an existential threat to liberal capital much longer. So the cottage industry of bullshit and spin that sprung up around counterterrorism was complemented by the cottage industry of bullshit that was proliferating around computer technology. And here we have Rafi Eitan, an artist of the possible, if ever there was one. And he's obsessed with counterterrorism, and he's realizing he can combine both. He can combine the bullshit of counterterrorism and the bullshit of software development into one unholy mess and get fucking rich in the process, And whether he knew this scheme was going to end up driving people insane for the next 30 years and counting, that's another question entirely. But to hear him describe the software, PROMIS seems like a magic bullet for intelligence work. Now dig this again from Gideon's Spies. Quote, "Intelligence operatives untrained in computer technology beyond knowing which keys to tap would be able to access information and judgments far more comprehensive than they could ever carry in their own heads. A PROMIS disk could fit a laptop computer and choose from a myriad of alternatives the one that made most sense. It would eliminate the need for deductive reasoning because there were too many correct but irrelevant matters to simultaneously take into account for human reasoning alone to suffice. PROMIS could be programmed to eliminate all superfluous lines of inquiry and amass and correlate data at a speed and scale beyond human capability." Ari Ben-Menashe says he was blown away by the capabilities of the Mossad version of PROMIS. This is him here. Quote, "PROMIS was a very big thing for us guys, a very, very big thing. It was probably the most important issue of the 80s because it just changed the whole intelligence outlook. The whole form of intelligence collection changed. This thing, PROMIS, changed it." Now, Gideon Spies describes aspects of the Israeli version of the software that broadly align with what we know about the version the CIA and the NSA were using and selling. They all have a secret trapdoor installed, and this allows agents to remotely monitor what information people are searching for when they use PROMIS. Now, Benghazi and I broadly accept this is believable, and it was a huge advancement in the world of, spy tech. What made the Mossad PROMIS unique, at least according to Rafi and these other Israeli spooks, it's that they'd added modifications that enabled PROMIS itself to hack into online networks and databases without the need to have the software already installed on the target computer. And it's also claimed that they added artificial intelligence modifications, which gave PROMIS a deductive reasoning capability that was years ahead of other comparable spy tech. Benghazi is probably going to go off on this issue of artificial intelligence in the next chapter, so I'll leave that for him. In Eitan and Ari Ben-Menashe's accounts, by using the newfangled deductive reasoning capabilities that Lakem had apparently coded into the software, the Israeli PROMIS is supposed to have been able to automatically predict almost everything that a target was going to do by accessing every available piece of information about them registered on various databases. So they're saying it could sift through medical records, census data, bank records, phone bills, and so on at lightning fast speed. And this is a step beyond what we've already established it was capable of. Because what's unique here is that Eitan and Ben-Menashe are implicitly suggesting an agent could boot up a computer, type a target's name into PROMIS, and wait for the software to automatically sift through databases around the world, compile a complete biography of that person based on what it found, and through this deductive reasoning, tell the agent beat for beat what to do to neutralize them. So Eitan is suggesting that his boys made it something much more than just a database administration tool with a hidden spyware built into it. He's saying that they created the perfect automated spy. And this is before we even mention the other capabilities that the Israeli version is supposed to have had. So I'm not going to go too much longer on this because Benghazi and I will be discussing it in more detail in chapter 10. But I want you to get a feel for how cloudy and indistinct so much of this is and how difficult it is to verify much of it. And the reason it's hard to verify much of it is threefold. One, it's in the weeds intelligence shit that happened 30 years ago. Two, guys like Ari Ben Menashe made claims about the Mossad version of Promise that suggest they didn't actually understand how the original enhanced Promise even worked. You know, let alone this version that was loaded up with Israeli modifications and sold around the world. I mean, even Jim Keith and Ken Thomas point this out in Secret Government. And three, the spooks who were using and selling Spooky Promise had every strategic and financial incentive to exaggerate its capabilities. Now, I think it's obvious that Promise was an exceptionally well-designed program, you know, and the software developers in the intelligence community who added upgrades and modifications to the source code, they're no slouches, don't get me wrong. I mean, with that backdoor installed, Promise lets you monitor user activity, it can covertly interface with various databases, and under the right circumstances, you can even use it to surreptitiously manipulate or remove information contained on these databases. You could also use the information it collected from them to draw a picture of a person or a company or a government. But it wasn't a perfect portrait. You know what I mean? You still needed flesh and blood spies and analysts to understand what this data meant. Promise could only offer you a summary of important information, and what it deemed to be important was still determined by the people who programmed it. And one of its most fascinating applications, which we'll be touching on in this episode a little bit later, is as a tool for monitoring and manipulating financial markets and banking transactions. Our problem here is the stories about how these artificial intelligence and deductive reasoning models actually worked. They're fuzzy on the details. Mainstream journalists have tended to photocopy the same accounts from the same handful of sources again and again, and they gloss over the more complex issues around the claims of what Spooky Promise could do versus what was technologically feasible at the time. And all of this further degrades the picture. It adds more static and white noise to the image. These stories all sit in some strange space between history and mythology and public relations, basically. And this is creating lots of space for people to go absolutely wild with speculation and theories that may or may not be accurate, but are invariably very difficult or impossible to substantiate. So we have to ask the question here: what if this static and white noise was the point? So let's suppose that when Israel decided, as it tends to decide, that some Palestinians were getting out of line and they needed disciplining, maybe they also figured it'd be a useful psychological propaganda tactic to put the word out there. They had a brand new surveillance tool that could tell where a resistance fighter was hiding, right down to the room in their safe house, based purely on monitoring how much electricity or water is being used at a given property. You know, let's suppose that they put the word out there that this thing with the funny name could hack into CCTV cameras and satellites to identify rebels and their families with this sophisticated facial recognition tool that was coded into it. that there was nowhere Palestinians could hide, basically, if they decided to join the Intifada. Wouldn't it make sense that Rafi Eitan would want credit for spearheading the development of this supernaturally powerful Mossad version of Promise, especially if it helped in any way end the Intifada, end the uprising? To take it a step further, suppose you are Rafi Eitan and you are overseeing this. Now, the PR campaign for Promise will also help you attract customers when you begin selling your version of it on the international market. You'll have to rely on middlemen and front companies the majority of the time, because most of the customers you're trying to sell it to are official enemies and they fucking hate you. So you and your middlemen will say whatever you have to say to close that deal. Always be closing. And as a bonus, you build its reputation in the underworld rumor mill. You know, it's business creating business. So it can hack satellites, it can inventory a military base, right down to the last shell case in our shoelace. It can transfer billions of dollars out of the banking system and into offshore accounts without anyone finding out. You know, sometimes you'll have your middlemen pretend they've actually stolen this all-powerful new software from Mossad or the CIA directly, just as a way to establish their bona fides, you know. It's all just a sales pitch, man, to get Promise installed on the client's computer system. And when a client does decide to check it out, maybe they'll be momentarily disappointed to discover that the more outlandish rumors aren't true, but it'll have enough shiny baubles and nifty capabilities coded into it to give the marks the impression they're still on the cutting edge of spycraft or database administration or what have you. All that really matters is they are now using that bugged software, and you can then, as we've described, monitor what they do, build a picture of them based on how they use Promise. You can covertly enter their databases and steal or tweak or delete information as you please. You can create a network map of persons of interest. You can copy files and documents. You can monitor 1,000 data points that might tell you something vital. And you can do all this while you sit on the big pile of money that they just gave you. But in the meantime, those claims that you've been making, like all spooky disinformation ops, they spill over into other areas, you know, and they get picked up by the media, they spread, they drive people crackers, and sometimes they start fires, and these fires burn out of control and create a kind of feedback loop. And where do we find ourselves at that point, friends? We are once again in the wilderness of Mers. And maybe, just maybe, some of these fires, you know, burning in that wilderness, maybe they inspire other spooks and venture capitalists and their pet geeks on university campuses in Silicon Valley to go off and actually make the mythology surrounding Promise a reality. But we're not there yet. Or I could be totally wrong and the Israeli Promise really could hijack NSA satellites. I don't know. So paranoia and ambiguity, they make up a large part of the spooks playground, you know. And with that in mind, for our purposes tonight, we are interested in the perception of the software in the underworld of the 1980s and the 1990s. Because if Brian and Rico and Eitan and Ben Menashe and countless other underworld salesmen were all really just conjuring a kind of Promise mythology out of thin air, that doesn't actually matter, because the perception of what it could do put a concrete dollar value on its worth, and this triggered a kind of shadow world gold rush. And eventually this gold rush stacked bodies up to the 10th floor. So as an analogy, think about the deranging effect that Bitcoin has had on people for the last few years. You know, Bitcoin is nothing. It's built on a foundation of emptiness, but the perception of its value has created a brand new gold rush, and bodies have inevitably started falling as a result. I mean, just check out how many Bitcoin CEOs have mysteriously died or disappeared recently. It will shock you, or maybe it will. And make no mistake, guys, Rafi Eitan needed Promise to save himself, and eventually, so would Robert Maxwell. It is important to remember that Rafi was a very busy man during the 1980s, and his scheme to bug and sell Promise, that was just one of a number of irons that he had in the fire. I mean, we spoke about him briefly in the early part of this series, but I'd like to reiterate that he was already a legendary figure in the spook underworld by the time he was visiting Inslaw's offices, you know. This is the guy who fucking caught Adolf Eichmann, and he helped make Mossad one of the most formidable intelligence agencies in history. No exaggeration.
I got order that we are not going to kill Eichmann, but to take him alive. But in case Eichmann had the opportunity to run away, or in case I would feel that the police are going to let him free, okay, I would do all my best to kill him with some yoga exercise.
Would you have strangled him?
Geo exercise. It's very easy. It's very easy to kill a man.
With your hands?
Yeah. Have you tried it?
No.
Well, luckily.
So it's strange that the story of how he stole Promise should receive so much pushback and skepticism, because it isn't even the craziest fucking thing that he stole from the Americans. I mean, back in 1968, while he was still deputy chief of Mossad, Rafi and 3 other Israeli officials posed as chemists while visiting the office of a company called Numek. Numek was owned by Zalman Shapiro. He was a chemist, an inventor, and he was a very loyal Zionist as well. And Numek specialized in storing enriched uranium and transporting it to nuclear power plants. Now, around the time of Eitan's visit, 200 pounds of uranium mysteriously disappeared from Numek's inventory. Now, Eitan always denied his role in any possible theft, and a whitewash inquiry cleared Numek of any wrongdoing. But even CIA old boys like Carl Duckett have said it was obvious the uranium had been rerouted to Israel, and Eitan had supervised the job. Duckett was the head of the CIA's Directorate of Science and Technology at the time, and he maintained that there could have been no other reason for Eitan's presence at Numek's head office other than to plan a heist. Avner Cohen, he's the author of The Worst Kept Secret, Israel's Bargain with the Bomb. He said that Eitan being at the meeting with Shapiro was a clear indication that Mossad was involved, that it had in fact sanctioned the theft, and the uranium was a huge boost to Israel's nuclear weapons program.
I've got enough, thanks. But call me
Rafi
Flower Girl
built
again, I'll break your
his
nose.
career off these audacious types of moves, like any good spy master should, really. And he, quote unquote, retired from intelligence work in the 70s to pursue private business, but he maintained close links with the Israeli government, and he became a counter-terrorism advisor in 1978. In 1981, he became the head of Lekem. Lekem specialized in collecting scientific and technical intelligence, and it also operated a number of front companies that it used to obtain and smuggle stolen software and other electronic equipment that could be useful for Israeli defense projects. Eitan could have quite easily run down the clock here, left the day-to-day operations to some underlings,
Spike down, mid.
but that urge, that drive to be intense, to be audacious, that led him to make a couple of questionable decisions. And by the mid-80s, there was a growing sense that he was losing his touch. I suppose the most embarrassing incident was the Jonathan Pollard affair, which we discussed in part 1. The Pollard affair led to US intelligence discovering the existence of Lekem, and it damaged relations between Mossad and the CIA, as well as the Israeli and American governments.
One
Next
enemy
came
remaining.
Richard Kelly Smith. Now, Smith was an engineer who ran a company called Milco, which was a US defense contractor that still relied on Israel for 80% of its business. And in 1985, the US government discovered that Smith had sold around 800 Crytron switches to a company called Heli Trading, which turned out to be a front for Lekem. A Crytron it's kind of like a little tube that's filled with gas, and it's used as a switch to create a nuclear explosion. Detonate a nuke, anyway. Given the diplomatic fallout of all this and the harm that this could cause to the US-Israeli relationship, Lekem was officially disbanded in 1987, and Rafi was effectively pensioned off. He was given a much quieter job as the director of a state-owned company called Israel Chemicals. But if the stories he told Gordon Thomas are true, he still maintained such a considerable influence in the Israeli intelligence community that he continued to direct the operation to sell Promise at least until the beginning of the 1990s. Now, these various scandals and ignominy of being shunted into the role at Israel Chemicals, these were major factors in why Rafi wanted the Promise operation to be a success, at least in his telling. And we can be reasonably sure that he did continue to profit from its sale long after Lekem was disbanded. And as far as we know, the first test of the bug software
One enemy
occurred
remaining.
in Jordan, which is where Israeli spooks usually prefer to experiment with new gadgets or intelligence gathering techniques. And interestingly as well, Earl Bryan's company Hadron Inc. that had some contracts with the Jordanian military. So it's possible that he was using his company as a front for Mossad. This is from Gideon Spies, quote, "To sell Promise directly to Jordan was impossible because normal business links between both countries were still some years away. Instead, Earl Bryan's company, Hadron, made the deal. When the company's computer experts installed the program in Amman's military headquarters, they discovered the Jordanians had a French-designed system to track the movements of PLO leaders. Promise was secretly wired into the French system. In Tel Aviv, Rafi Eitan soon saw results as the trapdoor showed which PLO leaders the Jordanians were tracking." Now, Thomas goes on to describe how Yasser Arafat was chosen as a Promise target, and quote, "The PLO chairman was renowned for being security conscious. He constantly changed his plans, never slept in the same bed 2 nights in succession, and altered his meal times at the last moment.
Spike down,
Wherever
B.
Arafat moved, the details were entered on a secure PLO computer. But Promise could hack into its defenses to discover what aliases and false passports he was using. Promise could obtain his phone bills and check the numbers called. It would then cross-check these with other calls made from those numbers. In that way, Promise would have a picture of Arafat's communications. On a trip, he informed the local security authorities of his presence, and steps would be taken to provide protection. Promise could obtain the details by intercepting police computers. Wherever he went, Yasser Arafat would be unable to hide from Promise. So, if we think about that passage, we notice immediately that while the Promise ability to track Arafat,
See, you're learning a little bit.
Last round before the switch.
nothing Thomas describes comes close to doing what Eitan and Ben Menashe said it could do. There's no facial recognition voodoo, there's no artificial intelligence automation or satellite hijacking. The one claim that does raise an eyebrow is the idea that Promise could itself hack into PLO computers. But this, I think, is an example of what we were saying earlier. It's that neither the spooks nor the journalists interviewing them had a particularly sophisticated understanding of the finer details of this software or the technical language to describe certain functions, so they fudged it as a result, you know. Promise is not a hacking tool per se, but it is possible that the Israelis were using it in conjunction with some other hacking software to sort the information
standing. Spike down A.
Ultimately as well, the Promise trial run
Don't
produced
play with me,
very
you know, I'll
encouraging
play with
results.
you.
Quote, a spectacular success
I know.
came when an Intifada commander who'd moved to Rome called a Beirut number that Mossad's computers already had listed as the home of a known bomb maker. The Rome caller wanted to meet the bomb maker in Athens. Mossad used Promise to check all the travel offices in Rome and Beirut for the travel arrangements of both men. In Beirut, further checks revealed the bomber had ordered the local utility companies to suspend supplies to his home. A further search by Promise of the local PLO computers also showed the bomber had switched flights at the last moment. It did not save him. He was killed by a car bomb on the way to Beirut airport. Shortly afterward, in Rome, the Intifada commander was killed in a hit-and-run incident. Now again, you know,
Not ready yet.
this sort of intelligence collection and cross-referencing, this has always been a spy's bread and butter, but what Promise did was massively accelerate the speed at which you could do all this. And then it helped you prioritize and plan your response. It helped you do that. It did not do that shit for you, you know.
What?
The only issue that Rafi had with this scheme to sell Promise was his choice of partner.
That's my favorite character now.
For all his wealth and connections, he was kind of a hick, to be honest. And he simply didn't really have what it took to market
expect nothing
it
less
to
from
the
you.
clients that Eitan
Yeah,
was
you're fake
planning to
American.
target. You know, he didn't have that X factor that makes for a truly great salesman. And that's what Rafi needed. And he decided that a better partner would be Robert Maxwell. Now, the benefits of a partnership with Maxwell seemed obvious, you know. He understood the world of computers and he kept abreast of developments in the industry, at least up to
This
a
is
point.
controversial, but I
And
watch
he
this.
had connections in business and politics all over the world because of the sheer breadth of his business interests. He smelled like success as well and money to people in the elite circles that he moved in. And when the occasion called for it, he could actually turn on the charm, you know, like any great salesman. And more to the point, Eitan could trust Maxwell's
Spike down B.
self-interest. You know,
Thanks, Tom.
that and the fact that he had remained loyal to Israel ever since its founding.
Last
One
player
of his
standing.
firms, Degem Computers, was based in Tel Aviv and already served as a
The first
Mossad
round.
front, as did a number of
You should
other
play when
Maxwell
you
companies. Degem did a lot of business with companies and governments in Africa and South America, which opened up those markets to Rafi and Promise.
Okay, well,
And even better,
I have to.
Bob was secretly in dire financial straits and he needed to make a lot of money very quickly. And all through the 80s, Maxwell's determination to become the most powerful media mogul in the world. And finally fuck Rupert Murdoch for good. That allowed him to take out the platforms to finance his
Spike down
expansionist
A.
vision, you know. Now, why these banks lent him that money is itself a bit of a mystery, since he already had a reputation as a shady character. In 1969, Maxwell had tried to sell Pergamon to an American called Saul Steinberg by giving him the impression that Pergamon was generating millions in profit. When Steinberg had his own guys check out the book, he realized that Maxwell was snowing him, and he called us idiot. Then, he also discovered that Maxwell was moving money through his private companies and into Pergamon to keep the share price high. The Department for Trade and Industry in Britain that investigated Maxwell, and they said, quote, "Notwithstanding Mr. Maxwell's acknowledged ability and energy, he is not, in our opinion, a person who can be relied upon to exercise proper stewardship of a publicly
30 seconds
quoted
left.
company." This wasn't a big secret, you know. In fact, in 1974, Maxwell had to pay Steinberg $7 million in restitution, and this was a major news story for quite a while. And somehow, there appears to have been a near total failure of due diligence on the part of institutions like Goldman Sachs and National Westminster, you know, when Maxwell came knocking for a loan in the 80s. You could put some of this down to cocaine, obviously, but the sums that he was asking for are fucking mind-blowing. Maxwell Communication eventually took on around £2.5 billion in debt in order to finance the acquisition of the publishing. And this is while Maxwell was taking out a number of additional private loans, running to the tens of millions, which he funneled through his private companies. Now, because he was using Maxwell Communication as collateral, he used these private companies and money from his offshore trust to try and artificially juice its stock value. The same trick, the very same trick he'd used with Pergamon in the 60s, but on a much, much bigger scale. He moved as much as £250 million between them and Maxwell Communication between April and July of 1991, and this still didn't raise any red flags or set off any alarms. Now, the Mirror Group was one of his few reliably profitable holding providers. It published the Daily Mirror, the Scottish Herald, the New York Daily News.
I got one at least.
And a few others, you know. The bank said that the steady profit of Mirror Group had reassured them that he was good for the money they were lending him. But in truth, it's probably the only part of his portfolio that they could actually understand, because so many of his other interests were concealed in these baffling, perplexing networks of dark LLCs, trusts, and shell companies. So the banks started to get nervous when Bob decided to publicly offer 49% of Mirror Group to generate cash that he intended to use to fill the hole by giving away so much of Maxwell Communication as collateral. And this entailed yet another round of private loans funneled through these shell companies to juice the Mirror Group stock, or else, you know, using money that he made betting on foreign currencies as well. All told, he took out around $4 billion in loans from Goldman Sachs, Citibank, Lehman Brothers, the Swiss Bank Corporation, and who knows how many private underworld interests. And don't forget that Mossad is also juicing him throughout this period as well. And these
triple
are
stun, triple flashed,
£4 billion to, you know. And he'd also taken to, at this point, stealing money from the Mirror Group pension funds to try and fill these holes and keep himself solvent. So he may have figured that whatever commission he made on promise, it wouldn't do much to cover his nut, but maybe it'd be useful to keep the wolves from the door, you know. And a quick note on software piracy here as well. So the Federation Against Software Theft estimated that in 1992, 2/3 of all the software installed on computers in the UK was illegal. It was incredibly widespread software piracy. It was normalized. Some places that FAST raided, they would find floppy disks that just straight up labeled, you know, rip-off version of Photoshop or something like that. It's estimated that software piracy was worth as much as £4 billion a year. More to the point, Bob Maxwell's Mirror Group was about to be raided for software theft just before he died. And Fast finally got into those offices after his death.
One on site, one on site.
700 of the 800 software programs that the Mirror Group was using had been stolen from companies like Adobe, Microsoft, and Autodesk. So not only was the theft and sale of Promise not particularly usual for the times, Maxwell had previous for it.
Attackers win.
Rafi Eitan figured he could dodge most scrutiny just by adding enough modifications to the source code that an investigator couldn't really argue that it was the same software anymore. There's also the interesting fact, while we're on the subject, the interesting fact that Maxwell's daughters, Isabel and Christine, they would end up involved in the Silicon Valley scene. First, they founded Magellan, which was an early search engine that sorted and managed information pulled from the internet and other online databases. And after this, Christine would develop something called Chiliad, which was an information management program that could interface with any government database and mine them for pertinent information that would be particularly useful to law enforcement or security agencies. This is from eWeek, April 2009. Quote, "Think of it as an Uber Google, a search engine capable of pulling information from all of your organization's databases. The proof is in the pudding," said Paul McCohen, Chief Operating Officer of Chiliad. "A lot of people can talk about a lot of systems. This one has been in full-scale operation for 6 years, and it is the largest counter-terrorism system of its kind at the FBI. When they run 50,000 queries a day, almost all of those queries are going against around 1 billion documents in about 200 different search engine servers, and their average response time is less than 3 seconds because Chiliad pulls all this information together." So all told, it's estimated that Maxwell and Rafi made about $500 million selling these bugged copies of Promise. They sold it to government departments and security agencies in South Africa, Britain, Australia, Canada, South Korea, Argentina, Guatemala, Iraq, Libya, and a few Eastern Bloc countries as well, and working with the CIA. They're also supposed to have sold it to the World Bank. When the Promise story first broke in the early 90s, the World Bank took the claim seriously enough that it started an internal investigation. It took apart all its computers and, went through the circuit boards and everything, looking for not just Promise, but looking for the chip that facilitated the burst transmissions of information that Promise was collecting. I should point out, the World Bank always maintained they never found anything, but they would say that, wouldn't they? So Maxwell even managed to sell it to the KGB as well, which gave the CIA and Mossad a window into the Soviet security apparatus. And Mossad would even occasionally accept payment in trade instead of money, This is what apparently happened when they sold it to the Polish intelligence service, and they in turn allowed Mossad to steal a Russian MiG-29 in exchange for Promise and $1 million wired to a Citibank account that belonged to a Polish Air Force general. Now, Bob Maxwell also had considerable clout in US political circles, and it's possible that he used this to facilitate the sale of Promise and protect himself from scrutiny by handing out no-show jobs to friendly politicians connected to the Reagan administration and the Justice Department. In 1985, he registered Pergamon Brassy in Virginia. Now, PB was ostensibly a small software company that also produced literature on military and defense issues. Maxwell chose John Tower to be the chairman. Tower, of course, he'd led the Tower Commission in its investigation of the Iran-Contra affair. And in 1990, he served as chairman on Poppy Bush's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board, but behind the scenes, The pair of them apparently didn't get along particularly well. Bush is said to have been furious at the unexpectedly harsh conclusions of the Tower report, and supposedly he leaked a number of rumors about Tower's drinking habits and professional conduct that prevented him being appointed defense secretary. Tower also sat on the board of directors of Macmillan Publishing. Bill Hamilton provides some additional details here. Quote, in 1987, Pergamon Brassi hired 2 senior computer systems executives who resigned at the same time from the Meese Justice Department's Justice Data Center. This is Edwin Meese, remember. The proprietary IBM mainframe version of PROMIS had been operating at the Justice Data Center since the early 80s. George Viveris resigned his estimated $90,000 a year senior executive service position as director of the Justice Data Center to become vice president for technical services at the tiny Pergamon Brassi. He told a colleague at the Justice Department that his new salary would be in excess of $200,000 a year. Now, since we've mentioned Iran-Contra, it's worth considering a few of Maxwell's other US connections from the 80s, and we'll try to situate the PROMIS affair in its proper context, which is as just one of a number of crimes and schemes that the secret state was engaged in at this time. Now, to do that, we'll have to deal with Ari Ben Manash head on. He's been lurking throughout this miniseries and a few episodes before this, but now seems like the ideal time to really get to know him in a bit more depth. And one place to start is with a good line from a Sunday Times article written by Peter
down A.
1991. Now, he's writing about the journalist Seymour Hersh and Davies here, and he said, Hersh and Davies both suffer the same curse. They know Ari Ben Manash, a self-styled former Mossad agent and aspiring arms dealer whose pathological mendacity has stunned people on at least 3 continents.
One enemy
So we know that Ari was born to Iraqi Jewish parents in Tehran in 1951, and the facts about his life after that have been up for debate ever since he first made the headlines. He was definitely recruited by the Israeli Military Intelligence Directorate, and he used his contacts inside Iran to keep his superiors informed about the revolution as it unfolded. He first came to wider public knowledge after he was arrested in 1989 for trying to sell 3 Lockheed Hercules planes to Iran using false documentation. Like another intelligence asset that we know about, Ari was held at the New York Metropolitan Correctional Center and visited by his handlers, who were posing as lawyers, and they told him to keep his mouth shut. And some dumb muscle from Shin Bet also happened to stop by his mother's house in Tel Aviv, and they told her the same thing. It's intriguing to think about the context of this deal with the Iranians that he tried to pull off, because Israel had partnered with the Americans during Iran-Contra after the scandal broke. Powers that be were at pains to emphasize that the arms for hostages and the secret financing of Contras had all ended. And yet, here's an Israeli spy operating inside the States in 1989, trying to sell military hardware to Iran, yet again, American military hardware at that. So after hearing about these threats that had been made against his mother and family, Ari started talking to reporters about the October surprise and what he knew of Iran-Contra. The Israeli government, naturally, they tried to discredit him. You know, they said he was an embittered ex-translator for the IDF who was trying to save himself from prison. They tend to do that quite a lot when one of their spooks blows the whistle. They always turn out to be embittered ex-translators. I don't know why they always use that profession. Parts of the American media, they tried to prove the Israelis' version of the story. They desperately tried to prove it. But Ari's passport and his personal documents,
I haven't gotten a kill
they
yet.
showed a guy who was way too well traveled.
All I need's 1 kill.
To have ever just been a military translator, you know. And the New Republic even sent Stephen Emerson to Tel Aviv in a fairly transparent attempt to prove that Ari was full of shit. But people who'd known him there actually said no, he has worked on some really high-level intelligence operations,
Spike down
and
A.
he is known to Mossad. He
Oh,
also
this is
made
some clown shit.
Emerson, incidentally.
Stop.
He runs the investigative project on terrorism, and the IPT is effectively a private intelligence network. It was caught spying on the Council of American Islamic Relations in 2021. Anyway, at one time, never, he was regarded as a renowned counter-terrorism expert.
Last player
by the New
standing.
York Times. The thing about Ari is that, like any good spy, he mixes a lot of disinformation into
Switching
his
sides.
yarns to kind of strategically discredit himself. You're never entirely sure where the truth ends and the lies begin, and that's by design. So in a real sense, he kind of embodies the key theme of the entire Promise story. Well, what we can be reasonably sure
Sound
of
sensor up.
is that the Iran-Iraq war generated about $82 billion for arms dealers and fixers supplying weapons to both sides. All of that money had to go somewhere. You can't just have this dirty money sitting in warehouses on pallets. And it's believed that the Israelis created something called the Joint Committee, which was a partnership between the IDF and Mossad to manage their side of the operation. And they're supposed to have set up a mind-blowing network of shell companies and offshore accounts to move equipment and launder this money. They used a cut of the profits to finance separate off-the-books operations
Spike planted.
as well. They also funded Likud with it. They built settler homes in Gaza and the West Bank. They also washed a lot of the money through Bob Maxwell's own system of front companies, and he took a commission for himself and lent money from this dark money slush fund as and when he pleased. And initially, he was given permission to do this, but it's possible that Bob started helping himself to more cookies than that.
Last player standing.
To have, So Maxwell's contacts with those Eastern Bloc countries, they proved indispensable in helping to establish arms depots and transport hubs that were closer to the Balkans to facilitate the Iranian arms deals, And guys like him and Khashoggi traveled back and forth between New York and London to liaise with British and American intelligence operatives and keep various Iran-Contra players apprised of the situation. Much of the Joint Committee network, which came to be known as the Aura Group, that interlinked with the Enterprise Syndicate. John Tower was Maxwell's main point of contact for the American side of the operation. And in exchange for access to Reagan's inner circle, he received a $200,000 fee from Bob Maxwell and that no-show job at Pergamon Bussy. And this suggests that Tower was on Reagan's side of the Bush-Reagan split, that took place in the 1980s. Even Australia was pulled into this system of kickbacks and chaos around Iran-Contra. The Labour Party there received $10 million in bribes in exchange for giving the CIA and Mossad access to Fremantle ports, because it was thought that by setting up these indirect smuggling routes, it would help shield the operation from authorities, Now, Ari was an early Iran-Contra whistleblower, but, don't get it twisted. He wasn't snitching because of some crisis of conscience. You know what I mean? Ari Ben Manash has very few of those now. His handlers at the Aura Group had directed him to call the papers because they were concerned that Bush and Oliver North had gone rogue and were trying to cut them out of the arms trafficking network altogether. Ben Manash also says that he worked with Carlos Cardone and the CIA to circumvent the arms embargo against Iraq in order to ensure that Saddam's army was also supplied with, US military hardware. And while his handlers were fine with him blowing the lid on the American side of this, they were understandably a little bit more worried about what he might say after he got arrested in the late 80s for trying to sell those 3 airplanes. So, naturally, this level of corruption, and I understand how you might be feeling right now, the sheer scale of this stuff, it's sort of hard to process, you know. Almost everyone that you'd expect to dismiss all of this as a conspiracy theory has done so. But it's not difficult, I don't think, to accept at least the broad outlines of it, given we know for a fact that Israel was a crucial partner in Iran-Contra, and then by extension you have to start thinking through money flows, where the guns go, you know, who's responsible for cleaning all the profits. Someone has to be. Now, since the 80s, Ari has made a habit of appearing in the press anytime what we might call a deep event occurs. And every single time, his more outlandish claims jostle alongside stuff that turns out to be very accurate, you know. Once you are fully submerged in the wonderland logic of intelligence operations and high-level corruption, it makes perfect sense to think of him as simultaneously a consummate insider, a disinformation agent, a whistleblower, a con man, and a hustler.
Sound sensor up.
Because ultimately that is what every good spy aspires to be, and the best ones can emphasize these different sides of their personalities depending on what they want their audience to take away from whatever they're saying. The most obvious question you see
Dude,
people
there's
ask
stuff
about
on the
him
sand.
is,
Oops, I
if
keep
he's
talking
for
around
real,
chat.
why hasn't Mossad or the CIA killed him yet? You know? And the answer is because nothing he said has ultimately caused anybody all that much hassle. You know, most of his stories concern his role in incredibly complex and bewildering events 40 years ago, you know. And many of the key players are long dead anyway. And in that time, the professional fact checkers and debunkers have performed their function adequately enough. He rarely appears in any mainstream outlet these days without everything he says being heavily caveated and framed by the laconic skepticism of the well-remunerated establishment journalist, you know. But for all that, if you are at all familiar with the secret history that he describes, a lot of what he says makes a disturbing amount of sense. Now, Ari says that he was partnered with Bob Maxwell through the 80s, not just on Iranian arms deals and cleaning the Iran-Contra money, but also to sell Promise. Now, according to him, he also worked closely with Nick Davies. Davies was the Daily Mirror's foreign editor under Robert Maxwell. He was a working class lad done good. You know, he drove flashy sports cars, he wore Savile Row suits, and it's possible, maybe, that Maxwell saw him as some kind of kindred spirit, you know, in as much as he was capable of seeing that in other people. And it's not known exactly when he was recruited by Israeli intelligence, but Davies was making £1.5 million commissions brokering arms sales to Iran alongside Bob Maxwell and Ari Ben Manash by the late 80s. He also helped Maxwell locate Mordechai Vanunu, who was the Israeli scientist and whistleblower, and they fed him to Mossad in 1986. And then they followed this up with a smear campaign against him that they ran in the day. Now, Vanunu wound up doing 18 years in prison. Shit like this is why people around the world fucking hate British journalists, you know. So corroboration for this part of Ari's story, it comes by way of bank statements and receipts that he supplied to the press that had Davies' signature on them, and also from Davies' wife, who is Janet Fielding. Now, Janet is a relatively well-known Australian actress who she played the 4th and 5th Doctor Who's assistant. I told you that this series was going to be weird and kind of a cocaine supernova of fucking madness. Anyway, she says that she met Ari a number of times, and she was aware that he and her husband were involved in arms trafficking. And additionally, when Cy Hirsch published this stuff in his book, The Samson Option, the Mirror Group and Davies filed a lawsuit against him in October of 1991. And the way that panned out lends a bit more support to Ari's story. We'll circle back to this in a moment, but something else we should probably discuss here as well. When Adnan Khashoggi started taking a more hands-on role in the Iran-Contra operation. He cast around for a financial consultant who could help him hide his commissions and finder's fees from the taxman, And this is where he crossed paths with Jeffrey Epstein. So by the mid-80s, Epstein was running around Manhattan collecting powerful friends and describing himself as an intelligence agent and financial bounty hunter to close friends. Financial bounty hunting, in his telling, entailed tracking down stolen money and returning it to his clients, and he also ran a sideline helping other customers launder or hide money that they'd embezzled as well. The details are all pretty murky, and nobody's sure exactly where his wealth really came from, After a Ponzi scheme he was running with his partner Steve Hoffenberg collapsed in the late 80s, he just inexplicably walked away from the fallout while Hoffenberg went down. Now, Hoffenberg is also said to have acted as a mentor figure to the young Jeff. And reading between the lines here, you start to intuit that Epstein made the majority of his money in the early part of the 1980s from fairly crude investment hustles. He would approach a potential client and offer to double or triple their initial investment on a given stock. He'd pocket the money and he'd just keep stringing the marks along with bullshit and small figure interest payouts in the hopes they wouldn't get angry enough to go to the authorities, And this is from the famous Talented Mr. Epstein piece that was written by Vicky Ward in Vanity Fair. Quote, a lawsuit that Michael Stroll, the former head of Williams Electronics Incorporated, filed against Epstein shows that in 1982, IAG received an investment from Stroll of $450,000, IAG being Epstein's company, which Epstein invested in oil. In 1984, Stroll asked for his money back. 4 years later, he had received only $10,000. Stroll lost the suit after Epstein claimed in court, among other things, that the check for $10,000 was actually for a horse he'd bought from Stroll. So at the start of the decade, Epstein left a very high-paying job at Bear Stearns in extremely mysterious circumstances. He'd supposedly violated SEC regulations, either because he was lending money without permission to friends, or he was involved in insider trading, depending on which source you read. And it's possible that he became some kind of informant or asset in return for immunity, Now, Hoffenberg eventually hired Epstein as a consultant and paid him a retainer of $25,000 a month. And he even covered the rent on Epstein's office. And in addition to this, Jeff was still receiving around $100,000 a year in bonuses from Bear Stearns. And through the 80s, he reinvented himself as a financial consultant for billionaires. But it's unclear who really, aside from Les Wexner and Adnan Khashoggi, it's unclear who he ever really did any financial consultation for. It's known that he gambled on the international currency markets, and he always seemed to have tens of millions to invest in some venture or another. But again, it's quite hard to figure it out, He was a guy who seems to make the impossible possible. I mean, as we know, he would go on to run the world's first sex trafficking ring that had no customers, which is remarkable. And at the time of his early meetings with Khashoggi, he was already an influential figure in those circles where business and intelligence and organized crime merge into one amorphous mass. He had an Austrian passport with a fake name that listed his place of residence as Saudi Arabia. He had a concealed carry permit. And in 1985, he visited an arms dealer called Douglas Leese in London and gave him a loaded NYPD pump-action shotgun as a birthday present. Now, Leese taught Epstein most of what he knew about financial bounty hunting, playing the markets, and concealing and moving large sums of money. It's known that in 1981, Epstein and Leese attended a meeting at the Pentagon to discuss national security issues, and Leese played a major role in the Al-Yamar arms deal, which we covered last episode. And he was also the first person to recommend Epstein to Robert Maxwell. See, in the popular accounts of this time, Epstein met Ghislaine Maxwell in 1991 when she joined the New York society scene just after Bob had died. But Ari Ben Menashe has them meeting much, much earlier, at some point in the early 80s. And he says that after running some background checks on Epstein, Robert Maxwell recruited him directly into what Ari calls our group to assist in laundering money from the Iranian arms sales. So this directly connects Jeffrey Epstein to Iran-Contra. And presumably here, our group meant at least Maxwell, Davies, and Ari Ben Menashe. Ari also says that Epstein's sexual blackmail activities began much earlier than is commonly believed as well, and this was sanctioned by Mossad. And the main reason the source of his wealth is difficult to ascertain is probably because most of it came through this, insider trading, stock fraud, and providing money laundering services, like with Iran-Contra. Now, I don't know if Epstein was ever directly involved in smuggling drugs, but it's likely that he would have acted as revenge, or else he helped organize crime figures move their money and took a commission for himself. Everybody at his level in that line of work does the exact same thing. Steve Hoffenberg backs up Menashe's claim that Jeff and Ghislaine met earlier in 1991. He says it was at a society party in the mid-80s. She's supposed to have fallen for him immediately. Ari says that he could never understand what Robert Maxwell saw in him. He says that Epstein was a fairly dull guy, didn't possess any particular charm or intelligence. According to Ari, Maxwell overruled any objections to bringing Jeff into our group by explaining that the bosses had already authorized it. Presumably this meant either the CIA or Mossad. It's also possible that Maxwell was using Epstein in much the same way Adnan Khashoggi had, as a money launderer and a financial advisor, someone who might be able to help him find a solution to his mountains of debt. In fact, Epstein did actually claim to Steve Hoffenberg that this was one of the reasons Maxwell recruited him in the 80s. This may be how Epstein came to belong to intelligence, as Alex Acosta once put it. So, yeah, because by the 80s, Epstein's status and connections would have made him a fantastic asset and influence peddler, for any intelligence agency. Or he could have been recruited much earlier. There's the story about how he got a job he wasn't qualified for as a teacher at the elite Dalton School on the recommendation of OSS officer Donald Barr. And his son William Barr would, of course, play a major role in helping to cover up Iran-Contra and pardon most of the main players before serving again as Attorney General when Jeff definitely killed himself in the MCC in 2019. So for Bob Maxwell, whether he did hire Epstein as a financial consultant or not didn't ultimately make a difference, because by 1991, the guy was in a hole so deep that he was never fucking getting out of it. Word had spread across the banking world now that something was seriously wrong with Mirror Group and the Maxwell Imperium, And Bob was finding it impossible to extend his credit any further with anyone in the city of London. So institutions where he'd always been received like royalty, They were now only speaking to him through their lawyers or just sending threatening letters. And he realized that his share of the promise profits wouldn't even serve as a temporary fix to the trouble that he was in. So he tried the old shell game again, you know, it's just shuffling assets around, selling off this business to plug a hole in that one. Then he went to Israel and he tried to sell a company called Cytex Corporation. Yair Shemir, who was the son of the Israeli prime minister, he advised against it. You know, he was a senior executive at Cytex. And his dad, Yitzhak, wasn't just the prime minister, but also a Mossad agent as well. And Yair explained the facts of life to Bob in no uncertain terms, you know. They'd be unlikely to make the sale as quickly as Maxwell wanted. And even if they did, a deal like that could mean mass layoffs. And that was going to reflect pretty badly on the prime minister because his son sat on the board, you know. So Maxwell, at this, apparently lost his mind. He told Yair to go fuck himself. So Yair reported the conversation to his dad, who called a meeting with Maxwell's other Israeli investors and members of Mossad, who were usually one and the same. Word had spread to Tel Aviv that Maxwell's empire was on the verge of disintegration, and they'd also learned about the planned libel suit against Sy Hersh. So who knew what might come out during a long and protracted court case, you know, especially given how obviously unhinged, unstable Maxwell was at that point, you know. This is from Thomas, quote, "Later, it emerged that several options were discussed. Mossad could ask the prime minister to use his own considerable influence with the Israeli investors, not only to wait a while longer for their money, but to mobilize their own resources and contacts to find money to bail out Maxwell. Another option was for Mossad to approach its highly placed Syonim in the city of London and urge them to support a rescue package for Mossad." Just a quick note here. Syonim is a term for Mossad assistants, as they're called. An asset would be the equivalent for MI6 or the CIA. Anyway, at the same time, Mossad-friendly journalists in Britain could be encouraged to write supportive stories about the troubled tycoon. Again, those suggestions were discounted. The final option was for Mossad to break off all contact with Maxwell. There was a risk there. Maxwell, on the evidence of his present unpredictable state of mind, could well use his newspapers to actually attack the agency. On that somber note, the meeting concluded, and it was decided that Mossad would remind Maxwell of his responsibility both to them and to Israel. Hours later, Robert Maxwell left Tel Aviv in his private plane. It would be the last time, it would turn out, that anyone in Israel would see him alive. Yeah, the pressure was coming from everywhere by late 91. Besides his financial problems and his beef with Mossad and the planned legal action against Seymour Hersh, there were underworld rumors circulating that suggested that Bob had evidence linking MI6 to the assassination of Georgy Markov, who was a Bulgarian writer and dissident, and he was planning to publish this in the Mirror. He told his Mossad handlers directly that if they didn't bail him out financially, he was going to expose everything he knew about their activities. So this would have run the gamut, you know, from the Iran-Contra affair to the infiltration of the city of London to the role that he played brokering meetings between the KGB and Mossad during the August coup. And MPs in the House of Commons in Britain, they were now using parliamentary privilege to demand investigations into his and the city's links to Israeli intelligence. This in turn gave the papers justification to print reports about these speeches, you know. Scotland Yard, they suddenly announced that they were opening a war crimes investigation into Bob's conduct during World War II, specifically this issue of shooting the mayor in the town square. And I imagine there were lots of anxious late night conversations in back rooms and social clubs everywhere, from America to Britain to Israel. What was to be done about Bob Maxwell? Now, there's something telling about all this, which is that in the story of Robert Maxwell, you can see very clearly how members of these circles happily keep each other artificially afloat until it's no longer expedient. And then they just drop each other without a second thought, you know. I'm not trying to drum up sympathy for fucking Bob Maxwell of all people. Obviously, it's just, there's something darkly funny about it to me. And it's horrifying at the same time. I mean, I have another example of this, which also happens to indirectly connect Maxwell to BCCI. So, in 1999, the Accountants Joint Disciplinary Scheme in Britain announced that it was going to investigate Price Waterhouse Coopers for its role in the collapse of BCCI. See, in 1987, Price had become sole auditor for the whole of BCCI. This is prior to its mergers. And in 1991, they told the Bank of England that the entire institution had been cooking the books and embezzling from itself for years. And this is credited with starting the domino effect that led to BCCI's collapse. But the thing is, BCCI had been a ghost bank. It had been basically insolvent within 2 years of its founding in 1975. So there's no way that it really took Price 4 years to realize this. So the obvious question is, what were they doing in all that time? And why did it take the Bank of England so long to order Price to look at BCCI's books before they actually raised the alarm, you know? Now, the usual denials and obfuscations followed, but you don't need to be a financial expert to intuit there is something incredibly off about all of this. And in fact, you can just go to Price Waterhouse Cooper's Wikipedia page and look at the stunning number of controversies that they've been involved in over the years and draw your own conclusions, you know. Something changed at the start of the 90s, and it was decided by someone, somewhere, that now was the time to blow up BCCI. Maxwell comes into this because prior to merging with Price Waterhouse, Coopers had been found to have been fully aware of much of the fraud that Maxwell was committing in their capacity as his auditor. And they did nothing to stop any of it, you know. And similarly, IMRO, which is the City of London's regulatory body, they also gave Mirror Group the all clear just a month before Maxwell was fished out of the ocean. And this is despite the fact that pretty much every bank in Britain was now refusing to lend him any more money because they at least suspected that he was involved in illegal activity and rogue intelligence operations. Based off this, I've always assumed that everything Robert Maxwell was doing, you know, the embezzlement, stock fraud, you name it, it was all an open secret in the elite circles he moved in, you know. And I'm sure that he probably shared a lot of the loot that he was stealing with the people that he wanted to keep on side. And it's hard to escape the fact that nothing he did, spying for Mossad, robbing his own staff of the future, selling weapons to Iran, helping set up a global spy network, for fuck's sake, none of it really mattered until it became a problem for the people in the executive lounges. And once it did, just like with BCCI, just like with Epstein, just like with 100 other scandals, the press and the corporate PR machine swung into action to paint Maxwell as some kind of aberration, you know, a scam artist who hoodwinked the virtuous, wealthy, and well-connected. And this is what drives, I think, so much of the desire for his death to have been an accident or a suicide, because there are tens of thousands of jobs that rely on pretending that the system he profited from isn't totally corrupted and a joke, you know. So Alistair Campbell, funnily enough, the new Labour spin doctor, he was working at the Mirror as political editor in 1991. And when he met Maxwell at the Labour Party conference in October, he described how wild-eyed and paranoid Bob looked. The Mirror journalists were all having dinner at the Metropole Hotel, and Maxwell asked Campbell for a private word on a balcony. This is what Campbell said, quote, "Maxwell started to tell me how everyone was out to get him, how I had to understand that if these people destroyed him, they would also destroy the Labour Party. he was really ranting. He kept saying that it was vitally important that Neil Kinnock understood that. I remember there was a very narrow balustrade on the balcony, and I had this feeling that Maxwell sort of wanted to tip over it. It even half crossed my mind that I was going to have to reach out and grab him. My friend was going through a particularly manic phase at the time. He ended up having a chat with Maxwell that night, and I remember afterwards him saying to me, "My God, that guy is off his fucking head." I'm going to rely here on the accounts of Ari Ben Menashe and Viktor Ostrovsky to describe what I think is the most likely account of Maxwell's final days. So Ostrovsky was another Mossad agent who became a writer in the early 90s. And despite the best efforts of Western journalists and Israeli operatives to debunk what Ari and Ostrovsky have to say, their accounts line up quite closely. And the passion and fury that the media has expended in trying to discredit them makes me think there's at least a core of truth to what they have to say. So, October 29th, Maxwell got a phone call from a Mossad asset working out of the Israeli embassy in Madrid. And he was told that a decision had been made to bail him out, but he had to be in the Canary Islands within 48 hours. The caller had been instructed to adopt a reassuring and soothing tone, because it was crucial that Maxwell really believed all his problems were about to be solved. So Maxwell flew to Gibraltar, and then he sailed the Lady Ghislaine to Tenerife. On October 30th, 4 Israelis sailed from Rabat, which is a Moroccan port, to the Canary Islands. And their cover story was that they were scientists on an expedition. So Maxwell docked at Tenerife, and he ate dinner at the Hotel Mency. And he was then seen speaking to an unknown man late in the evening. Maxwell then abruptly returned to the Lady Ghislaine and ordered his captain to sail sort of aimlessly around the islands. And they did this for about 36 hours. The crew later said that he seemed very anxious and indecisive. And the story goes that 2 of the 4 Israelis piloted a dinghy out to the Lady Ghislaine in the middle of the night. And this is from Business Age magazine, quote, "The killers slipped over the side of the dinghy in wetsuits. Both were big men, specially chosen for the task. One carried a military kosh, the other a 20 milliliter syringe kit in a small hard plastic container. There were no screams, but Maxwell laughed as he fell back. He slumped to the boards. They then injected a killer air bubble into his jugular and set him afloat." The last time anyone spoke to him was around 4:45 on the morning of November 5th, and this is when he called his cabin crew to complain that his room was too cold. But the crew wouldn't raise the alarm that he was missing until noon, and his body was found around 5:30 p.m. that day by a fisherman floating about 15 miles away from his yacht. And this is from The Independent, quote, "An autopsy carried out in Tenerife found there was no seawater in his lungs, which would have indicated drowning. Instead, the pathologist, Dr. Carlos Lopez de la Mela, concluded he died of a heart attack. 2 days later, another examination was held. This time it was in Israel, where Maxwell's body had been flown for burial. In charge was Dr. Yehuda Hiss, an Israeli pathologist. Also present was Dr. Ian West, one of Britain's most eminent pathologists. There was evidence from badly ripped muscles and some internal bleeding that he had put up some kind of struggle before plunging into the water. They could not examine his heart, which had remained in the laboratory in Tenerife. Dr. Hiss thought Maxwell had suffered a heart attack and drowned. Dr. West disagreed. There was no heart attack. Maxwell had fallen into the sea and drowned. 3 pathologists, 3 different verdicts, 1 body. The puzzle was fueled by other findings. Maxwell's body appeared not to have the telltale signs of someone who had been in the sea a long time. His skin was not shriveled from the exposure to seawater, and he was not sunburned. His nightshirt was missing. He was naked. But, the captain of the yacht would later claim, his cabin door was locked from the outside. So how had he planned to get back in? Surely, if he had just stepped out for some air or to urinate over the side, which he often did, he would not have locked the door. So the Spanish pathologist wanted to send the body to Madrid for further tests, actually, but the Maxwell family intervened and they had it quickly sent to Tel Aviv for embalming and burial. His insurance company had every reason in the world to prove that he committed suicide, but they actually paid out £20 million and barely asked any questions. Ian Maxwell said he didn't think it was a suicide or a murder, just a bizarre accident, but Ghislaine was clear that she thought someone had killed him. So 1991, it's turning out to be a pivotal year for this series in the same way that 1976 was for Casino. I mean, you have the death of Robert Maxwell, the end of the Gulf War, the death of Danny Casolaro and a number of other people either connected to or investigating the Inslaw affair and adjacent scandals. You've got the collapse of BCCI, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the start of the Yugoslav wars, that will be coming in a future chapter, and the expulsion of Osama bin Laden from Saudi Arabia as well. John Hines, who chaired a presidential review board looking into Iran-Contra, he was killed in a very strange accident when his small plane collided with a helicopter on April 4th, 91. The very next day, John Tower and his daughter also died in a plane crash after a propeller malfunctioned. If you think about that kind of thing for too long, you start to feel your mind drifting to some really dark places. I mean, the Hines incident does seem to have been a really unfortunate turn of events, but with the tower crash happening the very next day, you can't help but feel that paranoia tickling the old cerebrum, you know. So viewed at a distance, it's hard not to escape the feeling that what Danny Casolaro stumbled into wasn't just a series of crimes and conspiracies. I think it was another period of reconstruction and consolidation inside the secret state, you know, similar to the one that took place in the 70s. The 1980s had been a psychedelic bloodbath, you know, wheels within wheels. And now a lot of accounts were being settled. You can find no better indication of what I mean by looking at the story of Robert Maxwell's downfall, and specifically his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. Because without even realizing he was doing it, Bob had effectively groomed his own replacement. And it's somehow fitting that Epstein emerges as a new key fixer in the global network just in time for the fall of the Berlin Wall, you know, the rise of Silicon Valley, and the end of history. Epstein, I think, is an example of a kind of deep operator that had always existed but would come to exert more control and influence as the 21st century approached. You know, he was obsessed only with money and status and developing connections. He was a total void. He was unencumbered by particularly deep concerns about the fates of nations or history. I mean, this is the guy who used to openly brag that he owned Djibouti and would just scream, "Tell me about the pussy," you know, in the middle of conference calls. So this increasingly powerful class of networkers that he belonged to, they were flush with cash from the deregulation of high finance and banking that took place in the 80s and the asset stripping of public infrastructure that followed. You know, these are the guys who would spill into Russia and sweep across it like locusts after the USSR imploded and just, rob that country blind. And their wealth is built off total bullshit, you know, from nothing but their ability to acquire the right contacts and impress shareholders and potential investors. But what they put that money into and their willingness to leverage blackmail, that is what gives them their power, you know, that and the fucking intelligence agency connections. Their politics, you can best describe them as a sort of high-tech reactionary libertarianism, and that will morph very quickly into fascism during the moments of crisis and collapse that are coming for us in decades ahead, you know. And they root their cash into all manner of political parties across the spectrum, think tanks, PR firms, startups, academic institutions, all to urge their vision of this new world order along. And with the prestige and the influence that their money buys them, they join groups like, the Trilateral Commission, the Carlyle Group, just like Epstein, and they sink their money into media, old and new. They create a system that self-selects for people who believe the same things as them, whether they're CEOs or interns just trying to get a foot on the ladder. And their end goal is a kind of technologically advanced feudalism in which every aspect of their subjects' lives will be targeted for profit. And in as much as the state still exists in this vision, it's only there to facilitate ever more rapacious exploitation and to supply muscle when the peasants occasionally revolt, They embody something that we've been talking about for a while, which is how political and ideological differences melt away above a certain level of wealth. And instead, the world comes to be divided into two groups of people. The ones who live inside the secret city and the rest of us who don't. But they aren't post-ideological, not in the strictest sense. In fact, their project is extremely ideological. They truly believe they should have everything and your existence should be at their discretion. Now, one thing the newer operators and the old spooks and assets like Maxwell or Eitan or Ari Ben Menashe have in common, it's a shared belief in the importance of mythology and PR. These things are what give you the power and influence. So whether you're telling people your spy software can hack CCTV cameras in 1982, whether you're telling them we're going to terraform Mars by 2030, if you can't construct a mythology for yourself or the agencies you represent, you aren't going to make it in that world. It's important to place the, shall we call them, the more esoteric elements of promise or the Maxwell story or the Epstein story in that context. Jeff would not have bought a painting of George Bush knocking over Jenga towers with paper airplanes, or let people call his private jet the Lolita Express, or built a temple surrounded by cow statues on his island, if he didn't know on some level that we would find out about it. It's essentially the same as Robert Maxwell pissing off the roof of his office building or getting his interns to pretend the president was calling him for advice. You see it echoed in Ghislaine Maxwell staging a photograph of herself reading a book about dead CIA agents while she was supposed to be in hiding. You are meant to see these things as raw exercises of power, as demonstrations of untouchability. And they hope it leaks to broader society. They pray that it imprints on the, dare I call it, the psychosphere, because this shit lights those fires we were talking about. It fries people's minds and it seeds confusion and paranoia, and it's amplified a million times over nowadays by the power of the internet and rolling news. But the funny thing is, even a Maxwell or an Epstein, for as all-conquering and immortal as they seem, they still only exist at the discretion of the machine. They think they're making decisions and deciding their own fates, but the second that machine considers them expendable, they are immediately dispatched. And it's no coincidence that Maxwell wound up dead during the peak of the media feeding frenzy surrounding him, just like Epstein would. When the people who really matter in that secret city were in danger of being exposed. But what those mysterious deaths ultimately demonstrate isn't that the machine is all-powerful and all-knowing. It's just the opposite. Those deaths are a good example of how people in that shadow state are constantly making bad recruitment decisions and running around in the dark, relying mostly on that mythology and hack PR work to prop up the illusion of overwhelming power. And when they make a bad investment, they make sure that they cut their losses, no matter how crooked or corrupt the ensuing cover-ups might look.